My child, I know. There are moments when the silence of your own life feels far too heavy to carry. I see you when you are sitting in the quiet, desolate spaces, wondering if I have forgotten you. I feel the ache in your chest, the questions spinning endlessly in your restless mind, and the heavy, exhausting sorrow that you try so desperately to hide from the rest of the world. You do not have to pretend with me. I am right there with you in the absolute depths of your pain, just as I am with Eleanor. Look at her for a moment. She is sitting alone at the worn oak table in her kitchen, bathed in the fading light of a late Tuesday afternoon. The sun is dipping below the horizon, casting long gray shadows that stretch across the cracked linoleum floor. This is the time of day that has always been the hardest for her since her husband Arthur passed away. It is the hour when this house used to smell of fresh coffee and a simmering dinner, the hour when the front door would open and his familiar heavy footsteps would echo down the hall. Now there is only the rhythmic hollow ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick feels like a tiny hammer against her fragile peace, a relentless, unavoidable reminder of the time that is passing without him. The silence in her home is not just an absence of noise. It is a physical weight pressing down on her tired shoulders. She stares at the empty wooden chair directly across from her, perfectly pushed in, completely untouched for months. She remembers the way Arthur used to sit there every evening, his reading glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose as he reviewed the day's mail, his deep voice carrying a warmth that made her feel entirely safe from the world outside. "I've got it covered, Elle," he used to say, his strong, calloused hands reaching across the table to pat hers. But those hands are gone now, and the safety she once knew has vanished into the quiet expanse of widowhood. Scattered across the polished wood in front of her is a messy, intimidating pile of envelopes. They are not letters from old friends or gentle words of comfort. They are stark white envelopes with demanding red lettering peering through the plastic windows, seeming to mock her vulnerability. Unpaid bills. Final notices. There is the electric bill, which has somehow doubled since the winter set in. There is the water bill, the property tax reminder, and worst of all, the towering stack of medical invoices from Arthur's final days in the hospital. She can still hear the rhythmic mechanical beeping of the heart monitor in her memory when she looks at those letters. She had traded the terrifying noise of that sterile hospital room for an even more terrifying financial silence here at home. The numbers printed on those pages are staggering, completely detached from the reality of her meager bank account. She had believed the life insurance would be enough to carry her through this darkest season, but the funds have trickled away, consumed by the relentless demands of a world that does not pause for grief. Eleanor reaches out her fingers, trembling slightly, and traces the edge of a final notice from the bank. The paper is thick, formal, and completely devoid of compassion. She feels a cold knot of panic tightening in her stomach, a physical ache that radiates through her chest. The fear is paralyzing. She is a woman who has always worked hard, always given her time to the church and her community, always trusted that doing the right thing and living an honest life would be enough to keep the darkness at bay. Yet here she is, drowning in a sea of paper and debt, feeling more vulnerable and abandoned than she has ever felt in her 62 years of life. She wonders with a sickening drop in her stomach if she will lose the very house where her children took their first steps. My child, if you have ever felt the crushing weight of circumstances completely beyond your control, you understand the despair that is washing over Eleanor right now. You know what it is like to stare down a mountain of impossibility and feel entirely unequipped to climb it. She thinks, I am far away. She feels the suffocating silence of the dining room and mistakenly interprets it as my absence. But I'm closer to her right now than I've ever been. My word promises that I'm close to the brokenhearted, and I save those who are crushed in spirit. It is perfectly okay to feel broken. It is okay to not have the answers, to not have a neat, tidy, and confident plan for tomorrow. I do not demand a perfect, put-together faith from my children when their world is falling apart. I welcome your messy, honest grief. I do not turn my face away when your faith wavers under the immense pressure of profound loss. Eleanor sits there holding her breath, trying to hold back her tears, trying to remain stoic, because she thinks that is what strong faith requires. She believes that crying is a sign of surrender, a sign of spiritual failure. But she does not realize that her tears are precious to me. Slowly, the brave facade she has been holding up all day begins to crack. Her vision blurs as the emotional dam finally breaks. A single tear escapes, cutting a warm, desperate path down her cheek, before falling silently onto the harsh black ink of a collection letter. Then another tear falls, and another, until her shoulders begin to shake with the agonizing force of her quiet sobs. She presses her hands over her face, a frantic attempt to hold herself together, as the overwhelming tide of loneliness washes over her completely. "I don't know how to do this, Arthur," she whispers to the empty room, her voice thick and heavy with sorrow. "I don't know how to be here without you." The agony in her chest is so deep, so profoundly sharp, that it threatens to consume her entirely. She feels as though she is entirely abandoned, a fragile ship drifting aimlessly in a vast, dark ocean without an anchor. She lowers her hands, resting them flat against the pile of demanding papers, and finally she lifts her tear-stained face toward the ceiling. She doesn't have eloquent words. She doesn't have a perfectly structured petition, a recited scripture, or a joyful song of praise. All she has is her profound, devastating honesty. "Lord," she whispers, her voice barely a fragile thread floating into the vast, quiet house. "God, please, I can't do this alone. I am so tired. Are you even there?" It is a broken, desperate prayer. As the words leave her lips, they seem to dissipate instantly into the stillness of the kitchen. To Eleanor, the prayer feels entirely empty. It feels as though her quiet plea has simply drifted upward, hit the cold plaster ceiling, and fallen right back down onto the linoleum floor. She waits for a sign, for a feeling of warmth, for a sudden miraculous shift in the atmosphere. But there is nothing. There is only the relentless ticking of the clock and the deepening gray shadows of the evening. She interprets this continuing silence as a closed door. She believes that because she cannot feel my presence in this exact agonizing moment, her prayer has gone entirely unheard and ignored. But she is wrong, my child, so very wrong. I heard every single syllable. Before the broken words even formed on her trembling lips, I knew the deepest corners of her despair. Her prayer did not hit the ceiling. It pierced the very heavens and reached my ears instantly. The world may easily ignore the quiet suffering of a lonely widow, but I never do. Every tear she has shed, every quiet groan in the middle of the dark, sleepless night, has been seen, gathered, and held with the absolute utmost tenderness. I am already actively working in the unseen spaces of her life, weaving together a beautiful tapestry of grace that she cannot yet comprehend. Even when her night is at its absolute darkest, my hand is present, quietly holding the foundation of her world together. When she feels it falling apart, Eleanor lets out a long, shuddering breath, wiping the wetness from her pale cheeks with the back of her trembling hand. She decides with a heavy, defeated heart that she must gather the mail and put it away for the night. She simply cannot bear to look at the terrifying numbers anymore today. She reaches out, pulling the scattered envelopes together into a neat uniform pile, just the way Arthur used to organize them on Sunday afternoons. As she shifts the papers across the table, her knuckles brush against a small stack of crumpled grocery store receipts she had tossed down yesterday afternoon. They slide to the side, revealing something that had been hidden directly beneath them the entire time. It is an envelope, slightly thicker and heavier than the others. It doesn't have a clear plastic window, and it certainly doesn't look like a standard utility bill. Eleanor freezes her breath, suddenly catching in her throat, as she reads the bold red lettering stamped sharply across the front. It says one single terrifying word: urgent. Her breath hitches, trapping itself tightly in her throat as she stares at those 6 harsh red letters. Her hands, which only moments ago were gently straightening the edges of the other bills with practiced care, now hesitate to touch this new arrival. She knows deep in her weary bones What kind of letters arrive in thick envelopes stamped with red ink? They do not bring extensions or grace. They bring finality. Slowly, agonizingly, she slides her trembling thumb under the stiff flap of the envelope. The sharp, tearing sound of the thick paper echoes loudly in the silent, empty kitchen. A violent sound against the quiet grief of the room. She unfolds the heavy parchment. The stark black font leaps off the page, cold, clinical, and completely detached from the warm life she has built here. Notice of intent to foreclose. My child, the human body is a fragile thing when it suddenly collides with a terrifying reality. Eleanor does not scream or cry out in anger. Instead, the color entirely drains from her soft, wrinkled face, and an icy numbness begins at her fingertips, slowly creeping up her arms, until it wraps tightly around her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. She forces her eyes to read the words again, but they blur together, becoming a meaningless jumble of complex legal terms and threatening deadlines. Final warning. 30 days. Eviction. She lowers the heavy paper, slowly letting it rest on the table, right beside Arthur's empty chair. For a long, suffocating time, she simply sits there, entirely paralyzed by a fear so absolute, it steals the very breath from her lungs. And then, she looks up, her tear-filled eyes, sweeping slowly across the familiar shadows of the room. This is not just a structure of wood, brick, and drywall. This is the sacred sanctuary she and Arthur built together piece by piece over 4 decades of faithful, enduring love. Her gaze drifts toward the wide doorframe leading into the hallway, where dozens of tiny horizontal pencil marks are permanently etched into the white paint. They uniquely chronicle the exact moments their daughter Claire grew from a stumbling toddler into a confident young woman. She can almost hear the warm ghost of Arthur's deep laughter echoing in that hall as he pressed a wooden ruler gently to Claire's head, proudly announcing she had grown another half-inch since spring. She looks at the scratched hardwood floors near the living room rug, permanently marked by the frantic, joyful claws of the golden retriever they had adopted when Claire was 7. She sees the slightly crooked, beautiful fireplace mantel Arthur built with his own calloused hands. One snowy December, determined to have it completely finished before Christmas morning, so they could hang their stockings. She looks out the kitchen window toward the backyard, where the dormant rose bushes Arthur meticulously pruned every Sunday are waiting for the spring sun. Everywhere she looks, there is a precious memory. Everywhere she turns, there is an invisible, undeniable imprint of the beautiful, ordinary life she has lived within these 4 protective walls. My child, I understand the profound, complicated pain of your memories. I created the human heart to hold deep, abiding love, and because it holds love so completely, it must also hold the memory of what was lost just as fiercely. I see you when you touch an old photograph and feel the sudden sharp sting of yesterday pulling painfully at your chest. The world may quickly tell you to simply move on, to pack up the past in neat little cardboard boxes and stop looking back. But I know how tightly your fragile soul is woven into the spaces where you have loved deeply. I do not condemn you for grieving the beautiful chapters of your life that have closed. I weep with you when the weight of yesterday feels heavier than the promise of tomorrow. For Eleanor, the rich nostalgia of this house is a beautiful, comforting blanket that is suddenly being violently torn away by the terrifying legal reality sitting on her table. The stark contrast is almost too much for her fragile, grieving heart to bear. How can a home that holds so much love, so many answered prayers, and so many sacred family moments be taken away by a cold, faceless bank? She feels a profound sense of total failure washing over her, heavy and suffocating. Arthur had worked so incredibly hard to provide for them, waking up before the sun every single morning, for 40 years working overtime when the budget was tight. And now, in just a few short months of being a widow, she is losing the very safety he labored his entire life to protect. She picks up the heavy paper again, her eyes drawn reluctantly to the final sum demanded at the very bottom of the page. It is an impossible number. It is a towering mountain she cannot physically climb, a staggering sum she cannot manifest no matter how many extra shifts she might try to beg for at the local bakery where she works part-time. The reality is bleak, offering no visible way out of the crushing darkness. Her first desperate, very human instinct is to reach for the telephone resting on the kitchen counter. She wants to call her daughter. She wants to hear Claire's familiar voice, to finally let her guard down, to fall completely apart, to cry out that she is drowning, and beg for a lifeline. But as her trembling hand hovers anxiously over the receiver, a different, much heavier emotion violently grips her chest. Pride. Eleanor pulls her hand back, slowly curling her delicate fingers into a tight fist against her chest. Claire is so young, just barely starting her own independent life in the city, working long, grueling hours to build a career in a demanding field. She has her own expensive rent, her own mounting bills, her own quiet stresses. Eleanor clearly remembers the exhausted, hollow look in her daughter's eyes during Arthur's funeral, the way Claire's small shoulders slumped under the terrible, crushing weight of her own profound grief. How could Eleanor possibly add this immense, life-altering burden to her daughter's already fragile shoulders? How could she call her only child and say, "I have completely failed, and we are losing our family home"? The deeply ingrained fear of becoming a burden is a heavy, rusted chain that wraps itself tightly around Eleanor's grieving heart. It is a subtle, isolating lie that so many of my children believe when they are drowning in unexpected hardship. You convince yourself that your struggles are yours alone, to bear, that asking for help is a shameful sign of weakness, or that your loved ones will turn away in disappointment if they see how broken and helpless you truly are. But I designed you for intimate community, for honest fellowship, for carrying one another's heavy burdens through the absolute darkest valleys. You were never meant to carry the crushing weight of the world entirely alone. Eleanor, however, cannot see that beautiful truth tonight. The shame of her financial ruin is simply too loud. The stubborn pride of a mother wanting to protect her child is too strong. With a heavy sigh, she slowly folds the thick legal notice exactly along its original harsh creases, pressing her thumb firmly along the edge to flatten it. She carefully slips it back into the thick envelope, pushing it deep into the very bottom of the mail pile, completely hiding it out of sight. She makes a silent, resolute, and ultimately painful decision. She will handle this catastrophe alone. She will find a way somehow without destroying Claire's fragile peace. She will wear the heavy, exhausting mask of a strong, capable widow, even if the effort tears her apart inside. The quiet kitchen grows even darker as the last, faint sliver of the evening sun finally dips below the distant tree line outside the window. Eleanor rests her forehead in her hands, taking a long, shuddering breath, desperately trying to steady her racing, terrified heart in the growing shadows. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing ring of the telephone shatters the heavy, suffocating silence of the kitchen. Eleanor gasps, her heart leaping violently into her throat. For a terrifying, irrational second, she thinks it is the bank calling to demand an answer right this very minute. Her hands shake uncontrollably as she slowly reaches across the polished table, her wide eyes focusing on the small, glowing digital screen of the caller ID. It is Claire. Eleanor swallows hard, fresh panic rising swiftly in her tight chest. She wipes her wet cheeks frantically with the soft sleeves of her worn cardigan, clearing her throat twice to ensure the telltale tremor of her tears is entirely gone. She closes her eyes, taking one final deep, steadying breath, forcefully willing her facial muscles upward into a warm, convincing smile, desperately hoping the fake warmth will translate through the long phone lines. She lifts the receiver to her ear, completely unaware that hundreds of miles away, her precious daughter is holding her own phone with trembling hands, hiding a painful, heavy secret of her very own. "Hello, darling," Eleanor says, her voice pitching up just slightly, creating a practiced, artificial melody designed to project absolute peace. "Hi, Mom." Claire's voice filters through the small speaker, carrying a tight metallic edge of profound exhaustion. The chaotic sound of rushing city traffic and a distant wailing siren echoes faintly in the background, painting a picture of a restless world so incredibly far removed from Eleanor's quiet, devastatingly still kitchen. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Eleanor asks, her desperate grip on the plastic receiver tightening until her fragile knuckles turn a stark, bloodless white. She forces a small, breathless laugh that does not reach her eyes. It has been so beautifully quiet here today. I'm just doing some reading, keeping busy around the house. The lie immediately leaves a bitter, ashen taste in her mouth. My child, how often have you worn this exact same suffocating mask? How many times have you walked into a crowded room carrying a devastating burden that is actively crushing your spirit, only to smile brightly and tell everyone that you are doing just fine? You convince yourself that you are being remarkably strong, that you are protecting the people you love from the messy, uncomfortable reality of your pain. You believe that true, unwavering faith means never showing your cracks to the world. But I did not design your human heart to endure the immense pressure of profound suffering entirely alone. When you hide your struggles out of stubborn pride or the fear of being a burden, you build invisible, towering walls that actively keep out the very comfort I am trying to send you through the people who love you. Eleanor is building one of those walls right now, laying down the heavy bricks with every forced, cheerful syllable. My day was fine, Claire says softly, but there is a distinct heavy pause before the word, a slight, unmistakable tremor that completely gives her away. Just incredibly long. They are restructuring the entire department at the firm and, well, it's just a lot of moving pieces right now. A lot of uncertainty. A mother intuitively knows the subtle hidden frequencies of her child's voice. Eleanor instantly hears the tight, anxious strain in Claire's words, the unspoken, terrifying fear of unexpected layoffs and financial instability that Claire is desperately trying to mask with casual, dismissive conversation. Eleanor's fierce maternal instinct immediately flares to life. She wants to ask the hard, probing questions to press gently and find out what is truly keeping her precious daughter awake in the middle of the night. But Eleanor cannot ask. She is entirely trapped by her own deliberate deception. If she asks Claire to open up and be deeply vulnerable about her financial fears, Claire will inevitably turn those same compassionate, probing questions back onto her. Claire will ask about the mortgage payments, about Arthur's lingering medical bills, about the life insurance policy that was supposed to last for years, but vanished in mere terrifying months. So Eleanor slowly retreats into the safe, shallow, and ultimately hollow waters of small talk. Well, just make sure you are eating properly and getting enough sleep, dear, she says softly, her eyes drifting painfully back to the terrifying stack of unpaid bills sitting innocently on the polished oak table. You always work much too hard, just like your father did. I know, Mom, Claire whispers, her voice suddenly sounding incredibly small and fragile, exactly like the little girl who used to hide behind Arthur's legs when strangers came to the front door. I really miss him. Those four simple words strike Eleanor directly in the chest, a physical, agonizing blow that completely shatters her fragile, carefully constructed composure. Tears instantly well up in her eyes, hot, demanding, and utterly undeniable, blurring the harsh red ink of the foreclosure notice she has tucked away at the bottom of the mail pile. She presses her trembling fingers fiercely against her mouth, desperately stifling a rising sob. I miss him too, baby. Eleanor manages to whisper, her voice thick and trembling, despite her best desperate efforts to control it. Every single minute of the day, for a brief suspended moment, there is only silence on the telephone line. It is a remarkably heavy, pregnant silence, thick with the shared, unspoken agony of their mutual grief. My child's silence is very often the loudest conversation of all. In that quiet, agonizing space, two women who love each other deeply are both sitting in their own private darkness, entirely convinced that they must carry their terrible burdens alone in order to protect the other. It is a tragedy born from a place of deep love, but it is firmly rooted in a pride that absolutely refuses to embrace the vulnerable humility of asking for help. I see the immense emotional pressure building dangerously inside Eleanor's chest. The sustained strain of holding up this massive facade is physically and spiritually exhausting her. Her frail shoulders are slumped forward, her breathing is alarmingly shallow, and the terrifying anxiety of the 30-day eviction deadline is a constant screaming siren in her mind. She is desperately trying to be the steady, immovable anchor for her daughter, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that her own ship is rapidly taking on water and slowly sinking. Listen, Mom, Claire finally says, clearing her throat loudly to push past the sudden overwhelming wave of emotion. I actually have to get back to my desk to finish this brief. I just really wanted to hear your voice before I stayed late. Of course, sweetheart. Go do exactly what you need to do. Eleanor replies, eagerly grabbing the offered conversational escape route, even though it breaks her heart to end the call. I love you so very much. I love you too, Mom. I'll call you this weekend. There is a soft final click, and then the steady, monotonous, unforgiving drone of the dial tone fills Eleanor's ear. Eleanor slowly lowers the receiver, placing it gently back onto its plastic cradle on the kitchen wall. The absolute silence of the empty house rushes back in to surround her, but it feels significantly heavier, much darker now than it did before the phone rang. The conversation, instead of bringing the warm, soothing comfort of genuine connection, has only magnified her agonizing sense of utter isolation. She has never lied to her daughter before. The deception sits like a cold, jagged, immovable stone in the very bottom of her stomach. She feels an overwhelming, desperate need to flee the kitchen. This room with its glaring overhead light and the towering, terrifying pile of financial demands sitting on the table offers absolutely no peace. She pushes herself up from the wooden chair, her legs feeling incredibly weak and unsteady beneath her. She leaves the threatening bills exactly where they are abandoning the suffocating space. Eleanor wanders aimlessly down the short, shadowed hallway, her soft slippers making absolutely no sound on the worn runner rug. She doesn't consciously decide where to go, but her grieving, desperate heart acts as a compass, guiding her careful steps directly toward the one room in the house that still feels completely alive, with Arthur's reassuring presence. She stops in the doorway of his old study. The room is entirely bathed in deep shadows, illuminated only by the pale, silvery moonlight, filtering gently through the large oak tree outside the window. The air in here still carries the faint, comforting scent of him, a familiar, deeply grounding mixture of old paper peppermint lozenges and the rich, woodsy aftershave he had faithfully worn for 30 years. It is a smell that immediately wraps around her exhausted frame, like a warm, protective embrace. Eleanor steps slowly into the room, her trembling hand trailing gently along the polished edge of his massive mahogany desk. Everything is exactly as he left it on his final good day. His favorite fountain pen rests precisely next to a yellow legal pad. A half-read historical biography sits on the corner, a faded grocery receipt serving as a makeshift bookmark. She sinks slowly into his worn leather armchair, letting the soft, distressed material creak loudly and settle securely around her exhausted body. She closes her eyes, letting the profoundly quiet atmosphere of the room soothe her wildly frayed nerves. For the very first time all evening, the tight, painful knot of panic in her chest begins to loosen just a fraction. She remembers exactly how many times she had sat in the small floral chair by the window while he worked late at this very desk, simply listening to the rhythmic scratch of his pen and feeling a profound sense of absolute security. When she finally opens her eyes, she gazes upward at the tall, crowded bookshelves lining the far wall of the study. The wooden shelves are packed tightly with heavy biblical commentaries, thick historical volumes, and worn novels they had lovingly collected together over a lifetime. But her eyes are inexplicably drawn to the very top shelf, nestled securely between two heavy brass bookends. There, sitting quietly in the shadows, collecting a very fine layer of dust, is a beautifully crafted, solid walnut box. Eleanor's breath catches softly in her throat. She remembers the exact heartbreaking day Arthur brought that beautiful box home. It was shortly after his final, devastating diagnosis, when the vibrant color had already begun to drain completely from his face, and the terrifying reality of his limited time had settled over their home like a heavy, suffocating winter fog. He had spent an entire quiet afternoon sitting at this very desk, writing carefully, organizing something incredibly important, before finally closing the small brass latch with a decisive click. He had looked at her with exhausted eyes that still held a lifetime of profound, unwavering love, and he had given her one very specific, remarkably solemn instruction. "Eleanor," he had said, his deep voice surprisingly steady, despite the rapid weakness overtaking his body. "I have put something in this box just for you, but I want you to promise me that you will not open it until the day you feel you cannot take another step. Leave it alone until you truly need it." She had kept that promise faithfully, carefully honoring his request through the absolute hardest months of her life. For nearly half a year, she had diligently dusted the wooden shelves around that small, solid walnut box, purposefully avoiding the dull brass latch, terrified of what might be waiting inside. To Eleanor, that box was a sealed time capsule containing the very last piece of her husband's heart, and she knew that once she opened it, there would be no more hidden messages left to discover. She had told herself week after agonizing week that she was strong enough to keep going without it, that she had not yet reached the absolute end of her endurance. But tonight, sitting in the heavy shadows of his old study, with the terrifying foreclosure notice waiting on the kitchen table, and the bitter taste of the lie she had just told her daughter still lingering on her tongue, the truth is entirely undeniable. She has nothing left in her own reserves. She cannot physically or emotionally take another step forward in her own strength. My child, there are seasons in your life when your circumstances will scream that you are entirely abandoned. There are moments when the towering walls of your reality seem so incredibly high, and the surrounding darkness so thick that the enemy will try to convince you that my promises have somehow expired. When the bank is threatening to take your home, when your body is failing, when the silence of a lonely house feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. It is so easy to believe that your hope is completely lost. But I want you to listen to me very closely. My promises remain absolutely true, even when your circumstances scream otherwise. I do not change when your situation changes, and I never leave you to navigate the terrifying valleys on your own. Eleanor slowly pushes herself up from the worn leather armchair, her joints aching softly in the quiet room. She steps deliberately toward the tall bookshelf, her eyes locked onto the small wooden box, resting quietly in the shadows. She reaches up her trembling hands, grasping the smooth, cool wood, and carefully lifts it down from its high perch. It is surprisingly heavy, carrying a physical weight that perfectly mirrors the immense emotional gravity of this moment. She turns and walks slowly back to the mahogany desk, placing the box gently in the very center of the green leather blotter. The silver moonlight catches the edge of the brass latch, highlighting a thin, undisturbed layer of dust resting across the polished walnut lid. Eleanor hesitates, her hands hovering nervously, just inches above the wood. A fresh, terrifying wave of conflict washes over her fragile heart. She is suddenly terrified that whatever Arthur left inside will not bring her comfort at all, but will instead only serve to make her miss him with a much deeper, more agonizing ferocity. What if seeing his familiar slanted handwriting completely breaks whatever tiny shred of resolve she has left? What if opening this box officially closes the final chapter of their life together, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the crushing reality of her lonely future? Fear is a masterful liar, my child. It will always try to convince you that stepping out in faith will only lead to more profound disappointment. It will whisper that keeping your heart closed and guarded is the only way to protect yourself from further pain. But true transformative healing requires vulnerability, and true hope requires you to reach out and open the very doors that terrify you the most. Eleanor takes a slow, deep, shuddering breath, filling her lungs with the comforting, familiar scent of peppermint and old paper that still lingers in the study. She closes her eyes, whispering a tiny, fragmented plea for strength, and then she reaches out and rests her fingers against the cool metal of the latch. With a soft metallic click that echoes loudly in the absolute stillness of the room, she flips the clasp upward. Her breath catches sharply in her throat as she slowly lifts the heavy wooden lid, pushing it back until it rests open on its small brass hinges. She looks down into the shadowy depths of the box, expecting to see a stack of legal documents, a hidden life insurance policy, or perhaps a long, heartbreaking farewell letter sealed in a white envelope. Instead, resting peacefully on the dark velvet lining is Arthur's Bible. It is not a pristine, untouched book kept safely on a shelf for occasional Sunday mornings. It is a heavily worn, deeply loved testament to a lifetime of quiet, enduring faith. The thick black leather cover is completely distressed and softened by decades of his rough hands, holding it through countless church services, late-night hospital vigils, and quiet morning devotions. The gold lettering on the front has long since faded away, and the binding is wonderfully loose, holding pages that are soft, dog-eared, and deeply wrinkled from years of use. Eleanor stares at it. A profound, completely unexpected wave of curiosity washing gently over her, cutting softly through her suffocating anxiety. She reaches into the box with trembling hands and lifts the heavy Bible out, cradling it reverently against her chest for a moment, before laying it gently on the desk in front of her. As she sets it down, the loose binding naturally falls open to the very center of the book, revealing several small, faded yellow sticky notes completely covering the margins. Eleanor leans in closer, squinting slightly in the dim, silvery moonlight, and traces her fingers gently over the thin, crinkled pages. Arthur had not just left her a book. He had left her a very specific, carefully constructed map. The Bible is intentionally bookmarked to specific scriptures he had meticulously prayed over during his final agonizing days in the hospital bed. She sees his familiar sharp handwriting crowding the narrow margins in blue ink, pointing directly to verses that he had heavily underlined. She looks at the first marked page, her eyes falling on the words of Psalm 46. The verse is highlighted with a bright yellow marker, and right beside it, Arthur had written, "For my beautiful Elle, when the house feels too quiet. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea." A single hot tear escapes her eye and falls quietly onto the dry paper, slightly blurring the blue ink of his handwriting. She turns the soft page, following the next yellow marker tab, to the Book of Lamentations. Here, Arthur had aggressively circled the verses with a red pen, as if he wanted to make absolutely certain she could not miss them. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Beside this verse, Arthur had simply written, "He will provide for you when I am gone. Trust him, Elle, even when you cannot see the road ahead, my child." Do you see the beautiful, quiet profoundness of what is happening in this dimly lit study? While Eleanor had spent the last few months feeling entirely abandoned, believing that her prayers were simply bouncing off the kitchen ceiling, she was entirely unaware that her beloved husband had spent his final dying days interceding for her future. Even as his own physical body was failing him, his unwavering faith was busy laying down a foundation of spiritual provision for the exact moment when she would need it the most. The crushing, terrifying grip of total despair begins to loosen its hold on Eleanor's exhausted heart. In its place, a very small, fragile glimmer of hope begins to ignite, like a tiny match struck in a pitch-black room. The towering mountain of her financial debt and the terrifying reality of the 30-day foreclosure notice have not physically vanished. But for the very first time since Arthur's funeral, she does not feel entirely alone in facing them. She realizes that the physical connection to biblical wisdom resting in her hands is much more powerful than the threatening legal document sitting on her kitchen table. She slowly turns back to the very front of the worn Bible, her fingers gently brushing over the distressed leather cover. As she opens the thick cover board, she notices something tucked carefully inside the front sleeve. It is a single piece of thick white notebook paper, neatly folded in half. Eleanor pulls the paper out with delicate, cautious fingers. The tiny spark of faith in her chest flares slightly brighter as she recognizes his clear, bold handwriting spanning the length of the page. It is a handwritten note addressed directly to her, penned in the very last days of his life. She smooths the creases flat against the green leather blotter of the desk, her heart pounding a heavy, anticipatory rhythm in her ears. She leans in close to the page, taking a deep, steadying breath, and begins to read the very first line of his final message to her. But before she can even finish reading the second sentence, a sudden, incredibly loud knock at the heavy wooden front door completely shatters the peaceful silence of the house, causing her to jump violently in the armchair. Her heart slams violently against her ribs, the sudden jarring noise pulling her sharply out of the sacred quiet stillness of Arthur's study. She hastily folds the white notebook paper, her hands trembling with a sudden, overwhelming mixture of shock and profound frustration. For the first time in months, she had felt a tiny, fragile spark of hope igniting in her chest. And now the harsh reality of the outside world is aggressively demanding her attention. She wants nothing more than to ignore the heavy wooden door, to stay hidden in the comforting shadows of the mahogany desk, and read her husband's final, desperate words to her. She is emotionally raw, hovering dangerously close to the very edge of a complete breakdown, and she feels she has absolutely nothing left in her exhausted spirit to give to anyone else tonight. Another knock sounds from the front of the house, much softer this time, hesitant, but unmistakably desperate. Eleanor releases a long, ragged sigh, placing the folded note carefully next to the worn leather Bible, and slowly pushes herself up from the creaking armchair. She walks down the dark, narrow hallway, her jaw clenched tight with the exhausting strain of the evening. She reaches the entryway, flipping the yellow porch light on, and peering cautiously through the small, frosted glass pane of the front door. Standing on the front of porch, wrapping a thin, faded gray cardigan tightly around her shivering shoulders, is Rachel. Rachel is the young, quietly struggling single mother who rents the small, incredibly rundown house right next door. Eleanor unlocks the deadbolt, the heavy metal sliding back with a loud clack, and pulls the heavy door inward, instantly feeling the bitter bite of the cold night air rushing into the warm hallway. "I am so very sorry to bother you, Mrs. Eleanor," Rachel whispers, her thin voice shaking visibly in the cold. "I wouldn't have come so late, but my electricity was just shut off." Eleanor stares at the young woman standing in the yellow porch light. Rachel's eyes are red-rimmed and cast downward, entirely filled with the heavy, suffocating shame of poverty. She hugs her arms tightly against her chest, her knuckles entirely white. "I just need a little hot water." Rachel continues, her gaze remaining stubbornly fixed on the wooden floorboards of the porch. "Just enough to make a warm bottle for Leo. The stove next door is electric, and the house is getting so incredibly cold, and he just won't stop crying." A sudden defensive spike of sheer frustration flares hotly in Eleanor's chest. Her own kitchen table is currently holding a final foreclosure notice. She is drowning in her own terrifying unpayable debts. She wants to scream out loud that she is completely broken too, that her own world is actively collapsing around her, and that she has absolutely no lifeboats left to offer a sinking neighbor. How can she possibly be expected to fix someone else's broken life when she cannot even save her own home? My child, there are seasons when your own personal pain feels so incredibly all-consuming that the very idea of extending compassion to someone else seems physically impossible. You believe that because your own cup is completely empty, you have absolutely nothing of value left to pour out for another hurting soul. You want to close your doors, hide in your darkest rooms, and nurse your own deep wounds in total isolation. But I operate in a beautiful, entirely unexpected economy of grace. I very often use the people around you, the unexpected interruptions, and the uninvited guests to deliver the exact comfort your wounded heart so desperately needs. When you choose to step outside of your own profound suffering to bind up the wounds of another, you will almost always find that your own heart begins to heal in the process. Eleanor looks closely at Rachel's trembling hands and suddenly recognizes something incredibly familiar. It is the exact same desperate, stubborn pride she had felt just an hour ago when she lied to Claire on the telephone. The crushing, isolating shame of financial ruin is a heavy, terrible burden they are both currently carrying in secret, separated by only a few yards of dark, frozen grass. The bitter frustration in Eleanor's chest slowly begins to melt away completely, replaced by a gentle, profound conviction. "Come inside, Rachel," Eleanor says softly, her voice losing its tight edge as she steps back and pulls the door open wider. "It is far too cold for you to be standing out there." Rachel hesitates for a fraction of a second, her pride fighting a losing battle against her desperate need. And then she steps into the warm, dimly lit hallway, her tense shoulders dropping in sheer, immediate relief. Eleanor guides the young mother gently into the kitchen, purposefully leading her straight past the dark oak table where the terrifying stack of bills remains securely hidden in the shadows. She steps up to the older gas stove, turning the dial until a ring of bright blue flame softly illuminates that corner of the room and sets a small dented tea kettle over the heat. As they wait together in the quiet kitchen, Eleanor notices just how frighteningly thin Rachel truly looks under the harsh, glaring overhead light. She sees how deeply the sheer exhaustion of single motherhood is carved into the delicate, pale lines around the young woman's eyes. Eleanor suddenly remembers the heavy pot of vegetable soup she had carefully made yesterday afternoon, the very one she hadn't even touched because her overwhelming grief had completely stolen her appetite. "Have you eaten anything at all tonight, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked gently, retrieving 2 ceramic bowls from the upper cupboard. Rachel swallows hard, her throat working as she shakes her head slightly, avoiding Eleanor's compassionate gaze. "I made absolutely sure Leo ate the last of the oatmeal before I put him down to sleep. I'll be okay." Eleanor doesn't say another word. She simply walks over to the refrigerator, pulls out the heavy metal pot, and places it squarely on the second burner of the stove. Despite her own devastating, paralyzing poverty, despite the terrifying looming reality that she might not even have a kitchen to cook in 30 days from now, Eleanor carefully ladles out a generous steaming portion of the hot soup and sets it gently on the counter, right in front of the exhausted young mother. "Eat," Eleanor says simply, her tone carrying the gentle, undeniable authority of a mother who will not take no for an answer. As Rachel takes her very first hesitant, trembling bite, a profound, undeniable wave of peace slowly begins to wash over Eleanor's wildly frayed nerves. By shifting her focus entirely away from her own terrifying, insurmountable problems and deliberately stepping into the immediate pain of someone else, the suffocating iron grip of her anxiety miraculously loosens its hold on her chest. She realizes with a quiet sense of awe that even in her deepest, darkest, most terrifying lack, she still possesses the incredible God-given capacity to show immense kindness. She is not entirely useless. She is not entirely empty. They stand together in the warm, comforting glow of the blue gas flames, two completely different women, quietly sharing a meager meal, and the deep, unspoken understanding of a shared, quiet struggle. Rachel begins to talk softly between bites her walls, finally coming down. She speaks about her grueling, endless shifts at the local diner, the terrible fear of not being enough, and her fierce, desperate, consuming love for her little boy. Eleanor simply listens. She offers gentle, affirming nods and a warm, fiercely compassionate presence, finding a strange, deeply beautiful comfort in simply being needed again. When the metal kettle finally begins to whistle a high, piercing note, Eleanor turns off the burner and carefully helps Rachel mix the powdered baby formula into the warm water. Eleanor thoughtfully wraps the heated plastic bottle in a clean, thick dish towel so the young mother won't freeze her bare hands on the short, dark walk back to her unheated house. "Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor," Rachel whispers, her tired eyes suddenly shining brightly with thick, unshed tears as they walk back to the front door. "I honestly don't know what I would have done tonight without you. You are a true blessing to us." "You're always welcome here, Rachel. Anytime you need anything at all," Eleanor replies warmly, and to her own quiet, profound surprise, she realizes she genuinely, wholeheartedly means it. She stands in the open doorway, letting the freezing wind whip around the porch, and watches carefully until Rachel is safely inside the dark house next door. Only then does Eleanor softly close the heavy wooden door and slide the metal deadbolt securely back into place. The house is perfectly, deeply quiet once more. But the silence no longer feels like a heavy, crushing, terrifying enemy waiting in the shadows. It feels remarkably softer somehow, thoroughly warmed and changed by the simple, beautiful, holy act of a shared human connection. Eleanor turns to walk back down the hall toward the study, eager to return to the worn leather chair, and finally read Arthur's handwritten note. But as she passes the small, polished entryway table, where Rachel had briefly set her meager belongings while buttoning up her thin coat, something bright catches her eye. Resting near the very edge of the dark wood, slightly crumpled and clearly left behind by accident in the young mother's rush to return to her crying baby, is a folded piece of paper. It is a weekly bulletin from a local community church, the bright blue ink standing out starkly in the dim yellow hallway light. Eleanor picks it up gently, fully intending to run next door first thing in the morning to return it. But her eyes naturally fall to the bold, italicized text printed directly across the very top of the front page. It is a designated verse of the week, meant to offer a word of encouragement to the congregation. She reads the printed words slowly, and the breath completely abandons her lungs, leaving her entirely stunned in the quiet hallway. It is Psalm 34, verse 18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Eleanor's hand begins to tremble violently, the thick paper shaking in her grasp. It is the exact same verse Arthur had heavily highlighted in bright yellow ink, sitting open on his mahogany desk at this very moment. Eleanor stands completely frozen in the dimly lit hallway, her eyes darting frantically between the bright blue ink on the crumpled church bulletin and the heavy shadows stretching toward the back of the house. Her breath, which only moments ago had finally steadied, now comes in short, ragged gasps. The sheer mathematical impossibility of this precise moment washes over her like a sudden wave of freezing water. Out of all the thousands of verses contained within the pages of Scripture, out of all the days in the year, and out of all the neighbors, Rachel could have asked for hot water? This exact specific promise has found its way into Eleanor's trembling hands for the second time in a single night. She turns slowly, the floorboards groaning softly beneath her slippers, and walks back down the narrow corridor toward Arthur's study. She moves with a delicate, cautious reverence, almost as if she is afraid that stepping too heavily might somehow shatter the fragile, invisible thread connecting these two remarkable moments. When she reaches the mahogany desk, she gently lays the folded paper directly beside the open, worn leather Bible. The silvery moonlight filtering through the oak branches outside illuminates them both side by side. There is Arthur's fading yellow highlighter marking the ancient text, and right next to it, the crisp modern print of the weekly community bulletin. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. My child, you so often dismiss these quiet, perfectly timed intersections as mere coincidences. When you are wandering through the dense, disorienting fog of your own profound grief, your logical mind demands rational explanations for the unexplainable. You convince yourself that a perfectly timed word, a sudden, inexplicable peace, or a verse that seems to leap directly off the page and into your specific pain is nothing more than random chance. But my word is not a static historical artifact gathering dust on a wooden shelf. It is living, breathing, and deeply active. I send it out specifically to seek you in the absolute darkest, most isolated corners of your life, speaking directly and intimately to your exact, unique situation. I will use the highlighted margin of a deceased husband's Bible, and I will use a forgotten piece of paper left behind by a struggling neighbor, all to whisper the very same truth to your terrified spirit. I see you. Eleanor sinks slowly into the worn leather armchair, her eyes locked on the two pieces of paper. A profound, beautiful sense of wonder begins to bloom very tentatively in the center of her chest. For a few fleeting seconds, she allows herself to embrace a cautious, fragile faith. She allows herself to believe that I am truly standing right there in the quiet study, with her holding her shattered heart together. But human grief is a complex, relentless tide, and it rarely recedes without a fierce fight. Almost as quickly as the wonder arrives, a heavy, dark wave of agonizing doubt rises up to violently swallow it. Eleanor's brow furrows deeply, and her jaw clenches tight. She looks away from the Bible and stares out the window into the pitch-black night, her heart suddenly hardening against the very comfort she just felt. The crushing reality of her circumstances aggressively demands a voice. If he is so incredibly close to the brokenhearted, her mind whispers bitterly, then why did Arthur have to die? If he saves those who are crushed in spirit, then why is there a final foreclosure notice sitting on the kitchen table right now? The questions swirl violently in her mind, tearing at the delicate fabric of her returning faith. She feels a sudden hot flash of genuine anger burning in her throat. It is so deeply frustrating to be handed a beautiful poetic promise of divine closeness when what she actually desperately needs is a physical, practical miracle. She needs the staggering sum of her mortgage arrears completely erased. She needs the threatening bank to simply leave her alone. She needs her husband back in his chair laughing and telling her that everything is going to be perfectly fine. Eleanor crosses her arms tightly over her chest. Tears of sheer, helpless frustration welling up and spilling over her eyelashes. She feels an overwhelming urge to simply close the heavy Bible, to snap the wooden box shut, and to walk away from the agonizing vulnerability of hoping in things she cannot physically see. My child, do not ever be afraid of this exact moment in your own journey. Do not ever think that your doubt, your fierce questions, or your profound anger will somehow cause me to turn away from you in disappointment. I am not intimidated by your frustration, and I do not require you to perfectly understand my ways before you are allowed to approach me. I welcome your struggle. It is entirely acceptable to wrestle with the agonizing space between the beautiful promises in my word and the terrifying realities of your current life. I would much rather you bring your raw, bleeding, unfiltered anger directly to my feet than hide behind a polite, silent, and disconnected facade. Eleanor does not find a magical instant answer to the agonizing questions swirling in her head. The profound mystery of her suffering remains entirely unsolved in the quiet room. But as she sits there staring at Arthur's handwriting, something subtle and deeply transformative shifts within her exhausted spirit. She realizes that pretending to be strong is exactly what has been slowly destroying her. She has spent months politely reciting the expected safe religious phrases at church, while completely burying her desperate, agonizing terror deep inside. Slowly, Eleanor uncrosses her arms. She leans forward, resting her elbows heavily on the edge of the mahogany desk, and buries her tear-stained face in her trembling hands. She takes a deep, shuddering breath. And for the very first time since the devastating day, she buried her husband. Eleanor prays an honest, entirely unscripted prayer. "Lord," she whispers, her voice cracking wildly in the silent study, completely stripped of any polite religious pretense. "I am so angry. I am so incredibly angry that he is gone, and I'm left here alone to carry this terrible weight." The words pour out of her like water from a broken dam, messy and painfully authentic. "I am completely terrified," she continues, her shoulders shaking with the sheer force of her quiet sobs. "I am losing the only home I have left, and I do not understand why you are allowing this to happen. The bulletin says you are close, but right now, you feel 1,000,000 miles away. I cannot do this anymore. I have no strength left to pretend. If you are truly here, please just help me, because I am drowning." She does not end the prayer with a polished, theatrical conclusion. She simply stops speaking, letting her broken, desperate words hang suspended in the still air of the room. "My child," that raw, agonizing confession, is one of the most beautiful, sacred prayers I will ever hear. When Eleanor finally drops her heavy shield of pride and lays her absolute, unvarnished brokenness entirely bare, she opens the door for my true peace to finally enter. There is no sudden dramatic lightning flash. The terrifying pile of bills on her kitchen table does not miraculously turn to dust. But as Eleanor sits weeping quietly in the leather chair, a slow, gentle warmth begins to settle over her exhausted body, easing the rigid, painful tension in her neck and shoulders. The crushing, suffocating grip of her panic slowly recedes, leaving behind a quiet, remarkably profound stillness in her chest. It is not the joyful peace of a problem solved. It is the deep, stabilizing peace of a woman who has finally stopped running and allowed herself to be fully seen exactly as she is. Eventually, the tears stop falling. Eleanor wipes her face with the back of her hand, takes one last look at the open Bible, and softly closes the heavy wooden lid of the walnut box. She walks slowly down the dark hallway to her bedroom, entirely exhausted, but carrying a tiny, fragile ember of hope that had not been there just hours before. She falls into a deep, dreamless sleep, enveloped in a quiet grace she cannot fully explain. Hours pass, and the dense, inky blackness of the long night slowly yields to the soft, pale gray light of early morning. The sun crests the horizon, casting long golden beams across the frost-covered grass of the front lawn. Eleanor wakes up feeling remarkably rested, the quiet, stabilizing peace from the night before still holding firm in her chest. She rises, deliberately refusing to look at the kitchen table as she brews a small cup of coffee. Today is incredibly important. She has a scheduled interview for a full-time administrative position at a medical clinic across town. It is a long shot, but it is her only viable chance to secure the steady, substantial income she desperately needs to try and negotiate a payment plan with the unforgiving bank. She meticulously irons her best black slacks and a modest cream-colored blouse, brushing her graying hair until it sits perfectly in place. She looks at her reflection in the mirror, taking a deep, steadying breath. She feels a cautious, fragile faith, steadying her trembling hands. She whispers a tiny prayer of gratitude for the new morning, grabs her worn leather purse, and steps out the front door into the biting chill of the early air. The frost crunches loudly beneath her practical shoes as she walks briskly down the driveway toward her older silver sedan. She slides into the driver's seat, her breath pluming in small white clouds in the freezing cabin. She inserts the metal key into the ignition, her mind already rehearsing the professional answers she will give during the crucial interview. Eleanor turns the key forward with a confident flick of her wrist. Instead of the familiar, comforting roar of the engine turning over, there is only a rapid, hollow, mechanical clicking sound. Eleanor freezes her heart, instantly dropping into her stomach. She turns the key all the way back, waits a breathless second, and twists it forward again. Click, 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 click. The dashboard lights flicker weakly, once, twice, and then entirely die, plunging the small cabin back into deep shadows. The fragile, newly restored peace of the morning is violently and completely shattered as Eleanor realizes she is now entirely stranded, and her only chance to save her home is rapidly slipping away. She stares at the steering wheel, her fingers still curled tightly around the cold, molded plastic, as if her sheer, desperate willpower alone could somehow force the heavy machinery to come back to life. The silence inside the freezing cabin is absolute, thick, and suffocating, broken only by the sound of her own shallow, frantic breathing. She twists her wrist, pulling the key backward and forcefully driving it forward again in one last, irrational attempt. This time there is absolutely nothing. Not even a weak click from the starter. Just the devastating metallic finality of a completely dead battery. Eleanor looks down at the small digital clock set into the center console, watching its faint green numbers flicker weakly before fading entirely into a dull, lifeless gray. It was 8:15. Her interview at the medical clinic, her one fragile, desperately needed lifeline, was scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp. The clinic is a 40-minute drive on a good day with perfectly clear roads. She has no money for a taxi. Her neighbors have already left for their own morning shifts, and there is absolutely no bus route that reaches her quiet suburban street in time to save her. My child, the human spirit, is a remarkably resilient creation, designed by my own hands to carry staggering weights through incredibly dark valleys. But you know as well as anyone that it is very rarely the mountain itself that finally breaks you. It is so often the small, sharp stone in your shoe. It is the ordinary, everyday frustration that arrives right at the very end of your endurance. For Eleanor, this car is not merely a broken piece of metal and wire. It is the final, undeniable proof that she is completely trapped. She pulls the key from the ignition, her hands shaking so violently that she drops it. The metal keys clatter loudly against the plastic floorboard, sliding just out of her reach beneath the brake pedal. She doesn't even lean down to retrieve them. She simply lets them go, her empty hands falling limply into her lap. How incredibly quickly the enemy of your soul rushes in to steal the delicate seeds of peace that were planted the night before. Have you ever experienced this devastating whiplash? My child, you spend hours on your knees in the dark, pouring out your broken heart, and you finally feel the gentle, reassuring warmth of my presence wrapping around your exhausted shoulders. You wake up the next morning feeling a renewed, cautious hope, ready to step forward in faith. And then almost immediately a brand new disaster strikes. A door slams shut. A car refuses to start. In those terrible, vulnerable moments, the lie whispers loudly in your ear. See, you were foolish to believe. The darkness tries to convince you that your spiritual breakthrough was nothing more than an emotional illusion, a desperate trick played by your own grieving mind. It tells you that your setbacks are permanent, undeniable proof that I have stopped listening, that I have finally turned my face away and left you to manage the wreckage entirely alone. Sitting perfectly still in the freezing cabin of the silver sedan, Eleanor believes the lie. The profound, beautiful peace she had felt sitting in Arthur's mahogany study just hours ago now feels like a cruel, mocking joke. She feels utterly, devastatingly foolish for ever allowing herself to hope. She looks down at the meticulous creases in her best black slacks, at the carefully ironed cream-colored blouse she had put on with such fragile optimism. It all feels like a ridiculous costume now. She is not a capable professional woman preparing to reclaim her independence. She is a broke, helpless widow, freezing in her own driveway, waiting for a bank to come and take away the very driveway she is parked in. Of course, she whispers to the frost-covered windshield, her voice thick with a bitter, heavy resignation. Of course this is happening. Why did I think today would be any different? She rests her forehead heavily against the freezing curve of the steering wheel. The biting cold of the molded plastic seeps directly into her skin, but she doesn't pull away. She is entirely out of fight. The profound exhaustion that has been stalking her for the past 6 months finally catches up to her, completely surrounding her, pressing the remaining air from her lungs. My child, a setback is never a sign of my absence. I do not clear every single obstacle from your path, because true enduring faith is not forged in the absence of trouble. It is forged in the fiery crucible of perseverance. I see Eleanor sitting in her frozen car. I feel the crushing weight of her absolute defeat. But I also know that what looks like a devastating delay to her human eyes is actually my protective hand at work. She cannot yet see that missing this specific interview is not a punishment, but a necessary pivot. But before she can walk through the door, I am actively opening for her. She must finally release the agonizing grief she has been desperately holding inside. For 6 incredibly long months, Eleanor has been holding her breath. She held it together in the sterile, beeping hospital room when the doctor gently shook his head and delivered the final, devastating news. She held it together at the crowded funeral, standing tall and stoic in the receiving line, graciously shaking hundreds of hands and offering polite, comforting smiles to people who were supposed to be comforting her. She held it together for Claire, actively masking her own terror, so her daughter wouldn't have to carry the weight of a broken mother. She had built an incredibly thick, reinforced dam around her heart, terrified that if she ever allowed herself to truly break down, she would never be able to put the pieces back together again. But you cannot hold back the ocean forever, my child. Eventually, the sheer, staggering pressure of unshed tears becomes far too heavy for the human body to sustain. A low, ragged sound escapes from the very bottom of Eleanor's chest. It is not a polite sniffle or a delicate, controlled cry. It is a deep, guttural moan of absolute, unfiltered agony. The dam shatters completely. She wraps her arms tightly around her own torso, curling her body forward over the steering wheel as the first massive wave of grief violently overtakes her. Sobs completely rack her fragile frame, shaking her shoulders, stealing her breath. She cries for the terrifying stack of red-lettered bills sitting on her kitchen table. She cries for the agonizing, suffocating lie she had to tell her precious daughter the night before. She cries for the terrifying prospect of strangers walking through her beloved home, packing her sacred memories into cardboard boxes. But most of all, she cries for Arthur. She cries for the empty wooden chair at the table, for the lingering scent of his peppermint and aftershave in the quiet study, and for the agonizing reality that he is never coming back to tell her that he has it all covered. The car becomes a sacred private cocoon for her long overdue mourning. The thick layer of white frost coating the windows completely shields her from the outside world, creating a tiny, isolated sanctuary where she doesn't have to be strong, where she doesn't have to be brave, where she doesn't have to pretend anymore. I am right there with her in that freezing cabin. I do not tell her to stop crying. I do not rush her through the necessary holy process of emptying her shattered heart. I collect every single hot, bitter tear that falls onto her dark slacks. I hold her closely in the sacred space of her absolute surrender. When you finally stop fighting, my child, when you finally fall completely apart, in my presence, you are finally in the perfect posture to be rebuilt. The intense, violent storm of her weeping lasts for a long time. It strips away her pride, her frantic planning, and her desperate need for control, leaving her entirely exhausted, but somehow feeling incredibly, profoundly lighter. Eventually, the heavy, racking sobs slowly begin to subside, transforming into soft, quiet hiccups. Eleanor takes a long, trembling breath of the freezing air, her chest aching with a deep physical soreness. She reaches into her purse with shaking hands, pulling out a crumpled tissue, and presses it firmly against her swollen red eyes. She leans her head back against the cold headrest, entirely drained. She has officially missed the interview. The job is gone. The terrifying reality of her situation remains completely unchanged, but the terrible, crushing pressure inside her chest has finally been released. She lowers the tissue, blinking her raw, sensitive eyes as she looks out through a small, clear patch in the frosted windshield. The morning sun is now fully above the horizon, reflecting blindingly off the icy pavement of the street. As she stares out into the cold, bright morning, the deep, heavy rumble of a large diesel engine breaks the quiet stillness of the neighborhood. Eleanor watches, her breath catching slightly in her throat, as a beautifully restored dark green pickup truck slowly turns off the main road and rolls deliberately up her short driveway. The heavy tires crunch loudly against the frost, pulling to a slow stop directly behind her dead silver sedan. The engine cuts off, and the heavy metal door swings open. Heavy leather work boots step out onto the frozen pavement, and a tall, broad-shouldered man she hasn't seen in years steps out into the morning light. Eleanor squints through the small, completely defrosted patch of her windshield, her exhausted, grief-clouded mind struggling to process the familiar, gentle features of the man slowly approaching her dead vehicle. It is Pastor James. He is not wearing the formal, sharply pressed suit or the polished shoes she is accustomed to seeing him in. Instead, he is dressed in a thick, worn canvas work jacket and sturdy denim, looking wonderfully ordinary and remarkably grounding in the crisp morning light. She realizes with a sudden jarring jolt of shock that she hasn't actually spoken to this specific man in years, not since he formally retired from the pulpit and moved a few towns over, returning only briefly to stand silently in the very back row during Arthur's funeral. Eleanor's immediate, deeply ingrained reaction is sheer, undeniable panic. Her pride, though thoroughly battered and bruised by the morning's devastating breakdown, surges forward one last time in a desperate, frantic attempt to protect her from being fully seen. She quickly scrubs at her tear-stained cheeks with the cold sleeves of her coat, frantically trying to smooth her wrinkled cream-colored blouse and paste on the polite, remarkably capable smile she has used as a shield for the last 6 months. She reaches for the heavy door handle, desperately intending to step out and assure him that everything is perfectly fine, that she was just having a moment of silly frustration with an old car. But Pastor James reaches the door first. He pulls the heavy metal open instantly, letting the freezing wind whip around her legs, and he does not greet her with a cheerful, superficial pleasantry. He looks directly into her swollen, red-rimmed eyes, completely bypassing the fragile, artificial smile she is trying so desperately to hold in place. "Eleanor," he says gently, his deep voice carrying an incredibly soft, unwavering anchor of profound compassion. "Your hands are shaking, and your lips are practically blue. Let's get you back inside the house." He doesn't ask for her permission, and he doesn't press her for an immediate explanation of the tears streaming down her face. He simply extends his large, calloused hand, offering a physical, steadying strength that her exhausted legs desperately need. Eleanor hesitates for a fraction of a second, the heavy, rusted chain of her independence pulling tightly against her chest. But the sheer physical cold and her absolute spiritual exhaustion finally win. She places her trembling fingers into his warm palm and allows him to gently help her out of the freezing cabin. They walk slowly up the frosted driveway and step through the heavy wooden front door into the quiet warmth of the hallway. As Eleanor unwraps her scarf, a fresh, terrifying wave of anxiety violently grips her stomach. The kitchen, the dining table, the glaring, undeniable evidence of her absolute financial ruin is sitting right out in the open under the bright overhead light. She tries to rush ahead of him, her practical shoes slipping slightly on the hardwood floor, desperately hoping to gather the terrifying red-lettered envelopes and shove them into a drawer before he can see them. But Pastor James follows closely behind her, stepping into the kitchen before she can hide a single piece of paper. His calm eyes sweep over the chaotic, scattered pile of final notices, past due utility bills, and the thick, unmistakable legal envelope bearing the devastating words, "Notice of Intent to Foreclose." Eleanor freezes entirely, her breath catching sharply in her throat as a hot, suffocating flush of absolute shame climbs rapidly up her neck and burns her cheeks. She feels entirely exposed, completely stripped of the dignified, capable widow persona she has fought so incredibly hard to maintain. I was just organizing some of Arthur's old mail," Eleanor stammers, her voice sounding incredibly thin and painfully hollow as she quickly reaches out to slide a grocery flyer over the bank notice. "It is just a bit cluttered right now. I have it all perfectly under control. My child." The human instinct to hide your deepest, most terrifying wounds is as old as the very first garden. When you feel the crushing, agonizing weight of failure, the enemy of your soul will immediately whisper that you must cover your shame, that you must pretend everything is perfectly fine, or else the people you respect will turn away from you in profound disappointment. You spend so much of your precious limited energy furiously guarding the heavy doors of your brokenness, terrified of what might happen if someone actually sees the messy, complicated reality of your suffering. But true transformative healing can never begin in the dark. I send people into your life not to judge the painful wreckage of your circumstances, but to sit with you in the absolute center of it. Pastor James does not politely look away, and he certainly does not pretend to believe her desperate paper-thin lie. He walks slowly toward the heavy oak table, pulls out the wooden chair directly across from her, Arthur's old chair, and sits down right next to the terrifying pile of debt. He rests his large hands flat on the polished wood, his posture communicating absolute unhurried safety. "Eleanor," he says softly, his tone completely devoid of any judgment or pastoral pretense, "you do not have to carry this heavy mountain all by yourself." Those simple, quiet, permission-giving words strike the very center of Eleanor's fragile, guarded heart. The last stubborn remnant of her fiercely protective pride finally snaps in half. She sinks heavily into her own chair, her shoulders collapsing forward as she buries her face in her trembling hands. The dam that had broken out in the freezing car breaks all over again. But this time she is not entirely alone in the terrifying flood. Through ragged, breathless sobs, the entire devastating truth finally spills out into the light. She confesses everything. She tells him about the rapidly dwindling life insurance money, the terrifying medical invoices that arrived long after Arthur's funeral, and the agonizing guilt she feels for not being able to manage the household finances the way her husband always had. She tells him about the lie she told Claire on the telephone just last night, terrified of becoming a burden to her grieving daughter. Finally, she points a trembling finger at the thick legal document sitting on the table and admits that the bank is going to take her home in less than 30 days, and the dead battery in her driveway just cost her the only job interview that might have saved it. "I have completely failed, James," she whispers, using his first name in a moment of absolute unguarded vulnerability. "I have absolutely nothing left. I'm entirely empty." Pastor James simply listens. He doesn't interrupt her desperate confession to correct her theology. He doesn't immediately reach for his Bible to quote a quick, cheerful scripture designed to awkwardly patch over her gaping wounds. He doesn't offer empty, generic platitudes promising her that I am going to miraculously drop a bag of money on her front porch by tomorrow morning. He understands the deep, sacred ministry of presence. He simply bears witness to her profound agony, embodying my own quiet, steadfast grace in the very center of her darkest room. When her tears finally begin to slow, leaving her staring blankly at the scarred wood of the table, Pastor James reaches across the short distance and gently rests his hand over her trembling, cold fingers. "I am so incredibly sorry, Eleanor." He whispers, his own voice thick with genuine, empathetic sorrow. "I cannot even begin to imagine how terrifying this last month must have been for you, carrying this massive weight in total secret." He squeezes her hand gently, his eyes filled with a deep, comforting warmth. "But you are not a failure. You are a grieving widow who has been hit by a devastating, unexpected storm. And the Lord has not abandoned you to drown in this kitchen. He sees exactly where you are, and He is sitting right here in the ashes with you." A slow, remarkably deep exhale leaves Eleanor's lungs. The agonizing, crushing pressure in her chest, the suffocating strain of pretending to be strong, dissipates entirely into the quiet air of the room. For the first time in 6 agonizing months, she finally feels completely safely known. Her terrifying problems have not vanished. The bank still wants its money, and her car is still broken. But the paralyzing sting of her isolation has been thoroughly broken. They sit quietly together in the warm kitchen for a long time, sharing the comfortable, profound silence that only true, enduring fellowship can provide. Pastor James quietly stands up, walks over to the older gas stove, and puts the small dented tea kettle on to boil, moving with a familiar ease that brings a tiny, grateful smile to Eleanor's exhausted face. He brings 2 steaming mugs of tea back to the oak table, setting one gently in front of her, before sitting back down. He wraps his hands around the warm ceramic looking thoughtfully out the kitchen window toward the frost-covered rose bushes in the backyard. I actually drove out here today because I was thinking heavily about Arthur this morning, Pastor James says, quietly shifting the conversation with a gentle, deliberate care. He came to see me at my house just a few weeks before his body finally gave out. Eleanor looks up from her tea, her heart suddenly skipping a tiny anticipatory beat. He went to see you, she asked, her voice barely above a fragile whisper. He was so incredibly weak those last few weeks. I didn't know he drove anywhere. He insisted, Pastor James replies, a remarkably fond, knowing smile touching the deep corners of his eyes. He wanted to talk to me about you. He was so incredibly worried about how you would handle the profound silence of this house after he was gone. He told me he was working on something very special to leave behind for you. A beautiful, solid, wooden box. Eleanor's breath completely catches in her throat. Her mind instantly flashes down the dark, narrow hallway to the mahogany desk in the study. She remembers the heavy walnut lid, the deeply worn leather Bible, and the thick, white, folded notebook paper she had barely begun to read the night before, when Rachel's desperate knock had completely shattered her concentration. He made me promise him something very specific that afternoon. Pastor James continues, leaning slightly forward across the table, his steady gaze holding hers with an intense, quiet purpose. He made me promise that I would drive out here and personally check on you right around the 6-month mark. And he told me to ask you a single, very specific question. If I found you struggling. Pastor James pauses, taking a slow, deep breath, and looks directly into Eleanor's tear-stained eyes. Eleanor, he asks softly, his words hanging heavily in the quiet kitchen. Did you ever turn his letter over and read the back of the note? Eleanor stares at the pastor, her eyes widening as the breath completely leaves her lungs. The back. She whispers, her voice, barely a fragile thread, hanging in the quiet kitchen. Her mind races back to the dark, silent study the night before. She remembers the overwhelming scent of peppermint and old paper, the heavy wooden lid of the box, and the thick white notebook paper she had carefully unfolded on the mahogany desk. She had only read the very first sentence, a simple, loving greeting from her husband, before Rachel's desperate, echoing knock at the front door had completely shattered her concentration. In the exhausting, emotional whirlwind of feeding the young mother and discovering the highlighted church bulletin, Eleanor had completely forgotten the unfinished letter waiting in the dark. Pastor James offers a slow, remarkably gentle nod. He doesn't say another word, simply lifting his ceramic mug and taking a quiet sip of the hot tea, granting her the silent, incredibly supportive permission she needs to go and find out for herself. Eleanor pushes her chair back from the oak table, the wooden legs scraping softly against the linoleum floor. Her legs feel incredibly heavy, but a sudden desperate urgency propels her forward. She walks quickly out of the bright kitchen and down the long, narrow hallway, leaving the terrifying pile of unpaid bills entirely behind her. She steps into the quiet study, where the morning sun is now streaming brightly through the window, completely chasing away the heavy silver shadows of the previous night. The worn leather Bible still sits open on the green blotter, and right beside it rests the folded piece of notebook paper exactly where she had abandoned it. Eleanor's hands tremble wildly as she reaches out and picks up the letter. She traces the familiar bold blue ink of Arthur's handwriting on the front page, feeling a profound, agonizing wave of longing wash over her chest. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she slowly turns the thick paper over. The back of the page is completely filled with tight, urgent paragraphs. My dearest Elle, the letter reads, I know you so incredibly well. I know that when I am gone, your very first instinct will be to try and carry the entire world on your own fragile shoulders. You will think that you need to be an unbreakable rock. You will desperately try to protect Claire from the painful reality of your grief, and you will convince yourself that asking for her help is somehow a sign of failure. Eleanor gasps softly, a hot, unexpected tear slipping instantly down her cheek and landing on her trembling wrist. It is as if Arthur is standing right there in the sunny room, looking directly into the deepest, most fiercely guarded corners of her frightened heart. Please, my beautiful wife, do not shut her out. The letter continues, the blue ink pressing deeply into the paper as if he had written the words with an intense, desperate conviction. Do not wear a mask for our daughter. She does not need you to be perfect right now. She simply needs her mother. Let her see your tears. Let her carry some of the heavy boxes. Healing cannot happen in the dark L. Promise me that you will tell her the truth. My child, the darkest, most incredibly isolating spaces in your life are almost always built by your own desperate secrets. When you choose to hide your profound struggles from the people who love you, you mistakenly believe you are shielding them from pain. But true family conflict and enduring relational distance do not usually begin with anger. They begin with the agonizing silence of hidden suffering. I have repeatedly told you that the truth will set you free, but I know how incredibly terrifying it is to step out of the familiar shadows and let your absolute brokenness be seen in the light. Healing requires a massive, courageous surrender of your pride. Eleanor lowers the letter, her hands dropping heavily to her sides as a profound, shattering realization washes over her completely. By lying to Claire on the telephone last night, she hadn't protected her daughter at all. She had actively pushed her away, building a massive invisible wall between them when they both desperately needed an embrace. She turns on her heel and walks briskly back down the hallway, clutching the white notebook paper tightly against her chest. When she re-enters the kitchen, Pastor James is still sitting quietly at the table, a steady, completely immovable anchor in the center of her chaotic morning. He looks up, his warm eyes instantly reading the deep, transformative shift that has just occurred in her spirit. Eleanor doesn't sit back down. She walks directly over to the wall phone hanging near the refrigerator. Her fingers shake so violently that she misdials the familiar number on her first attempt and has to press the plastic receiver down to quickly try again. The phone rings once, twice. Mom! Claire's voice comes through the small speaker, sounding incredibly breathless and heavily strained, entirely lacking her usual professional polish. I'm already at the office. Is everything okay? Eleanor closes her eyes tightly, pressing her forehead against the cool, painted drywall of the kitchen. All of the carefully practiced, perfectly artificial melodies she normally uses to disguise her pain completely evaporate. She has absolutely no energy left to maintain the suffocating lie. No, sweetheart. Eleanor whispers, her voice breaking violently on the very first syllable, completely stripped of any maternal pretense. No, everything is not okay. The line goes dead silent for a terrifying second. Eleanor can actually hear the distant, chaotic background noise of Claire's busy law firm completely fade away, as if her daughter had just shut a heavy wooden door to find a private space. Mom, you're crying, Claire says, the sudden sharp panic in her voice completely piercing Eleanor's heart. What happened? Please tell me what's wrong. I lied to you last night, Claire. Eleanor confesses, the heavy, agonizing words tumbling out of her mouth before her lingering pride can try to stop them. I lied to you, and I am so incredibly sorry. I told you that everything here was perfectly fine. But the truth is I am entirely, completely overwhelmed. She takes a ragged, desperate breath, looking over at Pastor James, who offers a slow, profoundly encouraging smile, urging her to step entirely into the terrifying light. The life insurance money is completely gone. Eleanor continues, her tears flowing freely now, hot and completely unhindered. The hospital bills from your father's final days were so much higher than we ever anticipated. I haven't been able to make the mortgage payments for months. I got a final certified letter from the bank yesterday afternoon, baby. They are going to foreclose. I am losing the house. She waits for the inevitable explosion of profound disappointment. She braces herself for the sharp, frustrated anger of a daughter, realizing her mother has completely failed to protect the family's sacred legacy. Instead, there is only a sudden, incredibly sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed instantly by the unmistakable, heart-wrenching sound of Claire breaking down into heavy, ragged sobs. Oh, Mom, Claire cries, her voice completely shattering through the speaker, utterly devoid of anger, but entirely filled with a profound, agonizing relief. Mom, why didn't you just tell me? Because you are so young, and you are working so incredibly hard. Eleanor weeps, her own chest aching with the deep, beautiful pain of true connection. You look so absolutely exhausted at the funeral. I couldn't bear the thought of adding my terrible failures to your heavy shoulders. I wanted to be strong for you. You don't understand. Claire whispers, her voice thick and trembling wildly. I was doing the exact same thing to you. I lied to you last night, too. Eleanor's breath completely catches in her throat. She grips the plastic receiver tighter, her entire body suddenly going completely still. What do you mean, sweetheart? The restructuring at the firm, Claire sobs, the heavy, crushing secret she had been carrying for weeks finally bursting open. They completely cut my hours last month. I've been completely terrified, pretending everything was perfectly fine because I didn't want to worry you while you were grieving Dad. I thought if I just worked harder, if I just kept quiet and pushed through, I could fix it on my own. I have felt so incredibly alone, Mom. I have been so scared. My child, look at the immense, beautiful power of absolute vulnerability. Two women deeply bound by profound love had been sitting in two completely separate, terrifyingly dark rooms, both entirely convinced they had to suffer in total isolation to protect the other. But the absolute moment one brave soul decides to strike a match and speak the honest, unvarnished truth, the heavy, suffocating walls of isolation instantly burn to the ground. Healing does not happen when you pretend your life is perfect. It happens when you find the profound courage to weep together in the messy, complicated ashes of your shared reality. Oh, my precious girl. Eleanor whispers, a deep, fierce maternal warmth completely rushing back into her exhausted spirit, actively replacing the cold, bitter fear that had lived there for months. I am so incredibly sorry that you have been carrying that terrible weight all by yourself. We have both been so utterly foolish, trying to hide our pain from each other. I forgive you, Mom, Claire says softly, her breathing finally beginning to slow into a steady, manageable rhythm. Please forgive me for not being honest with you, too. Always, baby. Always. Eleanor replies, feeling a massive invisible boulder permanently roll off her frail shoulders. The terrifying mask is completely gone, entirely shattered on the kitchen floor, and the relationship between mother and daughter is suddenly deeper, richer, and more profoundly connected than it has ever been in their entire lives. Listen to me, Claire says, her voice suddenly shifting, the panicked exhaustion completely replaced by a strong, fierce, unyielding determination. I am packing a bag right now. I don't care about the firm and I don't care about the hours. I am walking out of this office, getting in my car and driving straight down there. You don't have to drop everything today, Eleanor protests weakly, though her heart is practically singing at the beautiful prospect of holding her daughter again. Yes, I absolutely do, Claire insists firmly. We are family. We are in this terrible mess together now. I will be there in 5 hours and we will sit at the kitchen table and figure out a plan together. Eleanor closes her eyes, a radiant, remarkably hopeful smile breaking across her tear-stained face for the first time in what feels like an entire lifetime. Okay, sweetheart, she whispers. I will be right here waiting for you. Please drive carefully. She places the receiver gently back onto the wall hook, completely overwhelmed by the joyous, life-giving relief of a fully restored relationship. The agonizing sorrow of the morning has miraculously turned into a deep, unbreakable connection. She turns back to face Pastor James, her eyes shining brightly with the beautiful evidence of profound grace. But as her gaze drifts past the pastor and lands heavily on the terrifying pile of red-lettered envelopes resting on the table, the incredibly harsh physical reality of the ticking clock immediately reasserts itself. Claire was coming down to help her face the terrifying storm, but the unyielding certified deadline set by the bank was absolutely absolute. The foreclosure was not a vague, distant threat anymore. It was an immediate, terrifyingly imminent reality, and they were entirely out of time. They had exactly 24 hours left to save the house. Pastor James stays just long enough to pray a quiet, gentle prayer over her, his deep voice filling the warm kitchen with words of profound comfort and steadfast hope. He does not promise her that the bank will miraculously reverse its unyielding decision, nor does he guarantee that her financial mountain will disappear by morning. Instead, he simply asks that I would wrap my presence tightly around her exhausted shoulders and grant her the incredible sustaining strength she needs to face whatever tomorrow brings. When he finally stands, softly squeezes her trembling shoulder, and walks out. The heavy front door. The house falls quiet, once again. But this time the silence does not feel like a terrifying, suffocating enemy, waiting in the shadows to completely consume her. The afternoon hours begin to stretch and fade, the bright golden sunlight slowly surrendering to the deep bruising purples and grays of the approaching evening. This is the final night. The 24-hour deadline set by the cold, faceless bank is rapidly ticking down, echoing loudly in the rhythmic, relentless swing of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Eleanor knows that Claire is currently on the highway, driving desperately through the gathering dark to reach her. But until those headlights sweep across the frosted driveway, Eleanor must walk through this agonizing suspended space entirely alone. She begins to pace the empty rooms of the house. Her soft slippers glide slowly across the familiar hardwood floors, moving without any conscious destination. My child, have you ever paced the floors of your own life during the long, terrifying night of a final deadline? Have you ever felt the crushing physical weight of an impending loss pressing so heavily against your chest that you simply cannot sit still? You wander through the spaces of your unanswered prayers, feeling the intense, agonizing friction between what you desperately want me to do and the terrifying reality of what is actually happening. As Eleanor walks, her fingertips reach out to gently brush against the painted walls, tracing the invisible sacred geography of her entire adult life. She walks past the slightly crooked fireplace mantel that Arthur had built with his own calloused hands on that snowy December afternoon. She pauses by the wide doorframe in the hall, her eyes lingering painfully on the dozens of tiny horizontal pencil marks charting her daughter's growth. Every single corner of this structure holds a precious, irreplaceable memory, a beautiful echo of the incredible love she has experienced within these protective walls. A fierce, incredibly bitter conflict begins to rise in her fragile chest, actively fighting against the delicate peace she had found with Pastor James. The voice of her own human grief whispers that if she loses this physical house, she will lose her husband all over again. The enemy of her soul aggressively tempts her to embrace a deep, suffocating bitterness. The dark, intrusive thoughts demand to know why I am allowing her sacred family sanctuary to be stolen away by a collection agency. She feels a desperate, frantic urge to cling tightly to the house, to lock the doors, draw the curtains, and fiercely fight the inevitable outcome with everything she has left. My child, the human heart clings so incredibly fiercely to the illusion of control. You desperately build your safety out of bricks bank accounts and predictable routines, completely convinced that if you just manage the details perfectly, you can keep the terrifying storms of life at bay. But true enduring peace does not come from successfully manipulating your circumstances so that you never experience pain. True peace is found in the absolute terrifying surrender of your deepest desires into my capable hands, firmly trusting that my ultimate plan for your life is beautifully good, even when the immediate outcome completely breaks your heart. Eleanor reaches the very center of the living room and stops. She stands perfectly still on the large braided rug, her eyes sweeping slowly over the worn, comfortable furniture. The internal struggle reaching its absolute peak inside her spirit is exhausting her frail body. She is so incredibly tired of fighting. She is completely depleted from the endless months of carrying a terrifying, crushing weight that she was never truly meant to carry alone. She realizes with a sudden, startling clarity that holding on to this house with white-knuckle desperation is exactly what is actively destroying her peace. She cannot save the property. The staggering mountain of financial debt is completely insurmountable. The legal notices are entirely finalized, and no amount of anxious pacing in the dark will miraculously change the numbers on the bank's ledger. Eleanor closes her swollen, tear-stained eyes, her breath catching sharply in her tight throat. Slowly, her trembling knees begin to buckle. She sinks downward, the rough fabric of her dark slacks brushing against the braided rug, until she is kneeling entirely on the scratched hardwood floor, directly in front of the empty fireplace. She does not fold her hands in a polite, practiced religious posture. She presses her palms flat against the cold wood of the floorboards, bowing her exhausted head until her chin rests heavily on her chest. This is the great turning point, my child. This is the sacred holy intersection where human defeat miraculously collides with divine grace. Lord, Eleanor whispers into the empty room, her voice barely a fragile, trembling thread in the absolute silence. I cannot fight this anymore. I am so incredibly tired of being afraid. She takes a ragged, desperately deep breath, her frail shoulders shaking with the immense, agonizing weight of the decision she is about to make. This house has been such a beautiful, wonderful gift. She continues, hot tears slipping quietly from her closed eyes and falling onto the scratched wood. But it is just a house. It is just wood and nails. You gave it to us, and now it is gone. I have been so angry and so terrified of letting it go. But I cannot carry it anymore. I cannot save it. She lifts her tear-streaked face toward the dark ceiling, completely releasing the heavy, rusted chains of her stubborn pride and her frantic need for control. I surrender it to you. She weeps softly, her voice growing surprisingly steady as the profound truth of the words takes root in her spirit. I surrender the house. I surrender the memories. And I completely surrender my terror of the future. Do whatever you must do. Take me wherever you want me to go, even if I lose everything I own. Please just do not let me lose my faith in you. I trust you. I let it all go. As the final, incredibly beautiful word of her surrender leaves her lips, a staggering, miraculous transformation occurs within her exhausted spirit. The heavy, crushing physical sensation of panic that had lived directly in the center of her chest for the past 6 months instantly shatters. In its place, a massive, overwhelming wave of completely inexplicable peace washes fiercely over her entire body. It is not a logical, rational peace. Her bank account is still entirely empty. The foreclosure deadline is still looming just hours away, and she still has absolutely no idea where she will sleep next month. But she suddenly feels incredibly, overwhelmingly safe. She realizes that her true security was never actually found in the bricks and mortar of this building, nor was it ever secured by Arthur's steady paycheck. Her safety has always been, and will always remain, perfectly hidden in me. By completely yielding the terrifying outcome she had fought so hard to avoid, she has finally removed the massive barrier standing between her broken heart and my profound comfort. Eleanor stays kneeling on the scratched hardwood floor for a very long time, simply breathing in the quiet, remarkable stillness of the evening. The bitter anger is entirely gone. The paralyzing fear has been completely washed away, leaving behind a deep, gentle, abiding quietness. Eventually, she pushes herself slowly back up to her feet. Her legs ache softly, but she feels incredibly, wonderfully light. She walks deliberately out of the living room and heads down the dark hallway, stopping quietly in front of the small linen closet near the guest bedroom. She opens the white door, reaches up to the very top shelf, and pulls down a flattened, empty cardboard box she had saved from a grocery run months ago. Eleanor carries the cardboard into the center of the living room. She presses the sides inward, folding the bottom flaps together with a sharp, decisive motion, and retrieves a roll of clear packing tape from the kitchen drawer. The loud, harsh tearing sound of the adhesive tape cutting through the quiet house does not frighten her anymore. It sounds incredibly like the decisive sound of moving forward. She walks over to the wooden bookshelves lining the far wall, her hands moving with a steady, peaceful rhythm. She carefully picks up a framed family photograph, a beautiful sunlit image of Arthur holding a very young Claire on his strong shoulders during a summer trip to the lake. Eleanor traces the smooth glass with her thumb, offering a soft, remarkably genuine smile to the face of her late husband. She doesn't feel the sharp, agonizing sting of loss. She only feels a profound, overwhelming gratitude for the beautiful years they shared. She gently wraps the wooden frame in a soft blanket and places it carefully into the very bottom of the cardboard box. She is taking the very first incredibly brave step into her unknown future, actively packing away her precious past with a strange, undeniable peace. She seals the top of the box with one final long strip of clear tape, pressing it firmly down with the palm of her hand. Just as her hand smooths over the cardboard, a sudden sharp metallic rattle completely breaks the deep silence of the house. Eleanor's head snaps up, her eyes wide with mild surprise. The sound came directly from the front entryway. It is the distinct heavy clatter of the brass mail slot being forcefully pushed open. Eleanor stands up, wiping her dusty hands on her slacks, and walks curiously down the dim hallway. As she reaches the front door, the heavy brass flap swings shut with a loud snap. Resting quietly on the woven welcome mat, pale and distinct in the shadows of the evening, is a thick, certified letter. Eleanor stares down at the thick white envelope resting quietly against the rough woven fibers of the welcome mat. The sharp metallic snap of the brass mail slot still echoes faintly in the incredibly still air of the shadowed hallway. A few hours ago, the sudden arrival of this certified envelope would have sent her spiraling instantly into a debilitating, suffocating panic. She would have assumed it was the final devastating word from the bank, carrying the absolute non-negotiable date of her physical eviction from the only home she has ever truly loved. But my child, there is a profound, beautiful difference between the heavy exhaustion of defeat and the liberating peace of true surrender. Because Eleanor had just knelt on the hardwood floor of her living room and completely yielded her deepest, most terrifying fears into my hands. The crushing grip of her anxiety has been remarkably broken. She does not feel the familiar icy knot of dread tightening in her stomach as she looks at the mail. Instead, she simply feels a quiet, steady resolve. She bends down slowly, her knees popping softly in the quiet house, and picks up the envelope. It feels heavy and substantial in her grasp. She traces her thumb over the crisp edge of the paper, taking a deep, calming breath of the cool evening air seeping in from the edges of the front door, and turns to walk back down the corridor. She carries the letter directly into the kitchen, stepping onto the worn linoleum and moving toward the exact same oak table where she had wept so bitterly over her unpaid bills just yesterday. The bright overhead light casts a warm yellow glow over the scarred wood. She sits down in her chair, placing the envelope flat on the table in front of her. I know how deeply you long for my answers to arrive early. My child, I know you desperately want the visible provision to appear months in advance, so that you never have to experience the agonizing, terrifying ache of uncertainty. You ask me to calm the storm before the winds ever reach your fragile shores. But so very often, my rescue arrives at the final, seemingly impossible hour. It is not because I take any delight in watching your anxiety mount, but because it is only in that critical 11th hour, when all of your own human striving has completely failed, that you finally cease your frantic efforts and realize that your deliverance came entirely from my hand. I wait until you have completely let go, so that when the provision comes, you experience the absolute overwhelming joy of a pure, undeniable grace. Eleanor reaches out and retrieves a dull silver butter knife from the small ceramic holder in the center of the table. Her hands are surprisingly steady as she slides the rounded metal edge under the thick flap of the envelope. The paper tears with a crisp, finalizing sound that seems to hang suspended in the quiet kitchen. She pulls out a small, tightly folded stack of stapled documents. She braces her fragile spirit, fully preparing her eyes to see the bold, terrifying red ink of the foreclosure department. But as she unfolds the thick pages and smooths them flat against the table, there is absolutely no red ink to be found. The formal letterhead printed sharply across the top of the page does not belong to the aggressive mortgage lender. Instead, Eleanor sees a familiar dark blue corporate logo that she has not looked at in many years. It is the recognizable insignia of a large manufacturing company where Arthur had worked for over a decade, long before he transitioned to his final job and long before the terrible, exhausting years of his illness ever began. Her brow furrows in genuine quiet confusion. She reaches up, adjusting her reading glasses firmly on the bridge of her nose, and squints at the dense, formal typography filling the page. Dear Mrs. Eleanor Hughes, she reads aloud, her voice a quiet, hesitant whisper in the empty kitchen. We are writing to formally express our deepest condolences on the passing of Arthur Hughes and to finalize the disbursement of his supplemental employee benefits. Supplemental benefits. Eleanor's breath completely catches in her throat, a sudden frantic fluttering beginning deep in her chest. She reads faster now, her eyes darting desperately across the long, complex paragraphs detailing the existence of a forgotten, fully funded life insurance policy. It was a modest automatic benefit provided by the union during his long tenure there, something Arthur had likely completely forgotten about in the chaotic, painful, and financially draining years that followed his departure from the company. The letter explains in dry administrative language that it had taken the corporate office several months to process the death certificate, navigate the internal red tape, and finally locate her current updated mailing address. She turns to the second page with trembling, frantic fingers. There, printed clearly and boldly at the very bottom of the formal corporate letter, is the total final payout amount. Eleanor stops breathing entirely. She reads the staggering number once. She rubs her eyes forcefully beneath her glasses and looks at the paper a second time, entirely terrified that her exhausted, grieving mind is playing a cruel, devastating trick on her fragile hope. But the stark black numbers do not change. My child, I do not operate in the theatrical realm of fabricated cinematic magic. I do not simply drop unearned bags of gold from the sky to solve your earthly problems. I move profoundly and beautifully through the ordinary, practical, and incredibly realistic avenues of your everyday life. I take the forgotten, faithful decisions of a loving husband. From 10 years ago, I orchestrate the painfully slow turning of corporate paperwork, and I perfectly align the exact specific timing of a postal delivery to meet you at the absolute climax of your greatest need. This is the quiet, magnificent, undeniable reality of my mercy. The amount printed clearly on the page is not enough to make Eleanor wealthy. It will not buy her a sprawling mansion, nor will it completely erase the ongoing practical necessity of her early morning shifts at the local bakery. But as her brilliant racing mind instantly calculates the towering mountain of her mortgage arrears and the terrifying stack of Arthur's lingering medical bills, she realizes exactly what this specific miraculous check represents. It is just enough. It is exactly perfectly enough to satisfy the angry bank. It is exactly enough to halt the terrifying foreclosure process entirely, to pay off the suffocating past due utility debts, and to ensure that this sacred, memory-filled family home remains securely and legally in her name. The staggering, impossible weight of the last 6 agonizing months instantly and completely evaporates from the warm kitchen. Eleanor drops the stapled papers onto the oak table as if they are suddenly burning her fingertips. She covers her mouth with both of her trembling hands, a loud, joyous, entirely uncontainable gasp tearing its way out of her tight throat. The hot tears that fall now are completely, beautifully different from the agonizing, bitter weeping she had experienced in the freezing cabin of her broken car just that morning. These are the sweet, overwhelming tears of absolute gratitude. They are the incredibly joyous tears of a beloved, exhausted daughter who suddenly undeniably realizes that her father has been actively, purposefully working behind the scenes the entire time she thought she was completely alone in the dark. She pushes her chair back and falls to her knees, right there on the worn kitchen linoleum, completely and utterly overcome by the sheer, breathtaking magnitude of my provision. She does not have the breath or the composure for a long, complicated, beautifully structured prayer. She simply repeats 2 incredibly powerful words over and over again, her voice shaking with a radiant, unrestrained joy that fills the entire room. Thank you. She weeps loudly, her face lifted toward the bright overhead light. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Lord. She kneels in the center of the kitchen, her fragile heart overflowing with a profound peace that entirely surpasses all human logic or understanding. The terrible, suffocating fear that she would have to abandon her husband's sacred memory to complete strangers is permanently gone. The crushing, isolating shame of her financial ruin is completely, undeniably wiped away by a stroke of unexpected grace. Slowly, Eleanor gathers herself, pushing up from the kitchen floor with a renewed, vibrant strength she has not felt in her physical body in years. She picks up the incredibly precious corporate document, pressing it tightly and protectively against her chest, as if she is terrified it might suddenly vanish into thin air. Her mind races with a beautiful, frantic energy. She cannot wait to call Pastor James and share the incredible news. She cannot wait to call the bank tomorrow morning and hear the foreclosure canceled. But most importantly, most desperately, She cannot wait to tell Claire. She turns and walks quickly toward the living room, her slippers moving lightly over the floorboards. She stops near the braided rug, looking down at the single empty cardboard box she had constructed and taped together just moments before the mail arrived. It sits there as a silent, beautiful testament to the absolute surrender she had offered when she still believed all was lost. She smiles at it, a warm, remarkably genuine, radiant smile. She definitely won't be needing that box anymore. Suddenly, bright, sweeping headlights cut fiercely through the deep darkness outside the living room window, casting long, rapidly moving shadows across the painted wall. Eleanor turns her head quickly, listening closely as the familiar low, steady hum of a small car engine turns off the quiet street and pulls slowly into her driveway, parking directly behind her broken silver sedan. The heavy car door opens and shuts with a solid, echoing thud. It is Claire. She has driven for 5 exhausting, terrifying hours through the dark night, leaving her entire professional life in the city behind. She is completely prepared to walk into this house, pack up her precious childhood memories, and face the absolute worst reality alongside her grieving mother. She is stepping up onto the wooden planks of the front porch. Right now, her heart incredibly heavy with their shared, anticipated grief, entirely and beautifully unaware of the magnificent, life-changing miracle her mother is currently holding in her trembling hands. Eleanor does not wait for the heavy brass knocker to strike the wood. She pulls the front door open just as Claire's tired foot steps onto the top plank of the porch. The freezing night air immediately rushes into the warm hallway, but Eleanor barely feels the bitter cold. Claire stands under the yellow glow of the porch light, her posture radiating a profound, devastating exhaustion. She is holding a large, overstuffed canvas duffel bag by its canvas straps, her knuckles white with the strain. Her eyes are red and heavily shadowed, reflecting the agonizing burden she believes they are about to carry together. "I'm here, Mom," Claire whispers, her voice remarkably tender but thick with unshed tears. "I brought empty boxes in the trunk. We can start in the living room tonight, and I promise I will help you with every single piece of—" Claire does not get to finish her sentence. Eleanor steps right over the metal threshold and wraps her arms fiercely around her daughter's neck, pulling her into an embrace so tight and so incredibly full of life that Claire actually stumbles backward, half a step. "We do not have to pack, my sweet girl," Eleanor weeps, burying her face into the cold fabric of Claire's heavy winter coat. "We do not have to pack a single thing." Claire stands entirely frozen for a second, her arms hovering awkwardly in the frigid air, completely bewildered by the joyous, unrestrained sobbing vibrating against her chest. She gently pulls back her hands, resting cautiously on her mother's trembling shoulders, and looks into Eleanor's face. She expects to see the frantic, broken denial of a woman whose mind has finally snapped under the crushing weight of profound grief. Instead, she sees a radiant, breathtaking light shining in her mother's eyes. Eleanor lifts her trembling right hand, holding the thick corporate document up into the space between them. "Read this," she insists, her voice catching on a joyful, breathless laugh. "Read it right now." Claire drops her heavy duffel bag onto the porch floorboards with a dull, heavy thud. She takes the stapled papers, her eyes quickly scanning the formal blue letterhead before dropping to the dense paragraphs below. Eleanor watches her daughter's face with absolute brilliant anticipation, witnessing the exact, magnificent moment when the crushing weight of the world is entirely lifted from her child's shoulders. Claire's eyes widen to an impossible degree. Her breath stops completely. She reads the staggering numbers at the bottom of the second page, her lips parting in sheer, undisguised shock. "Mom," Claire whispers, her voice trembling so violently it barely makes a sound in the quiet night. "Mom, is this real? Is this actually real?" "It is real, baby," Eleanor replies, wiping the joyous tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Your father took care of it years ago, and the Lord brought it to our door at the exact moment we needed it most. The house is completely safe. We are safe." Claire's knees visibly buckle. The terrifying, agonizing fear she had carried alone in the city for weeks, combined with the devastating dread of her long drive in the dark, suddenly leaves her body all at once. Eleanor catches her daughter and the two women sink down together onto the hard wooden planks of the front porch, entirely ignoring the freezing temperature. They hold each other and weep, their joyous cries echoing beautifully into the stillness of the dark neighborhood. My child, whenever you are walking through a valley of profound suffering, the enemy of your soul will constantly whisper a very specific, devastating lie. He will tell you that your pain is entirely meaningless. He will try to convince you that your tears are simply evaporating into an empty, uncaring void, and that all of your agonizing struggles are completely wasted. But I want you to listen to my voice right now. I collect every single tear you cry. Not a single moment of your profound sorrow is ever wasted or unseen by my eyes. The agonizing delays, the terrifying deadlines, and the crushing pressure that forces you to your knees are all actively forging a beautiful, resilient faith within your spirit that cannot be created in the light. When the morning finally breaks, and it will always break, the joy you experience is not merely relief. It is a deep, transformative, holy gratitude that completely reshapes the way you walk through the rest of your life. After several long minutes, the biting cold of the porch finally coaxes them to stand. Claire picks up her discarded bag and they walk inside, shutting the heavy door firmly against the dark. As they step into the bright, warm kitchen, the entire atmosphere of the house feels remarkably different. It is no longer an empty, echoing tomb, holding only the painful ghosts of yesterday. It feels like a sanctuary again, a place actively breathing with the vibrant promise of tomorrow. They sit across from each other at the oak table, looking at the miraculous letter resting on the polished wood. Claire's face is completely transformed, the gray, anxious exhaustion replaced by a warm, peaceful color. But as Eleanor watches her daughter smile, a deep, gentle conviction settles over her restored heart. She realizes that this incredible provision was not given simply so she could lock her doors, pay off the bank, and return to her quiet, isolated life. She had spent the last 6 months hiding her pain, terrified of being seen, and fiercely protecting her pride. That suffocating isolation had almost destroyed her, and it had almost destroyed her relationship with her only child. She cannot go back to being isolated. A faith that has been so beautifully rescued from the ashes must become a faith that flings its doors wide open to the world. Eleanor stands up from her chair, a sudden bright energy animating her movements. "Claire, sweetheart," she says, a brilliant smile touching the corners of her eyes. "Go into the dining room and pull out the good plates, the ones with the blue floral pattern, and find the extra chairs." Claire looks up entirely confused, but wonderfully amused. "The good plates, Mom. It is almost 9 o'clock at night. What are we doing?" "We are celebrating," Eleanor declares, her voice ringing with a firm, joyful authority. "I have a massive pot of vegetable soup on the stove, and we are not going to eat it alone. Start setting the table. I will be right back." Eleanor grabs her warm cardigan from the hook by the door, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders, and steps back out into the freezing night. She walks deliberately across the frosted, crunching grass that separates her property from the rundown house next door. There are no lights on in the neighboring house, save for a faint, flickering blue glow coming from a small, battery-powered lantern in the front window. Eleanor steps onto the sagging wooden porch and knocks firmly on the door. A moment later, the door creaks open just a few inches. Rachel peers out into the dark, her face pale and lined with profound exhaustion, holding a sleeping Leo tightly against her chest, wrapped in 3 different blankets to fight the bitter cold of the unheated house. "Mrs. Eleanor," Rachel whispers, her voice thick with confusion. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is more than okay, Rachel," Eleanor says, her smile radiating a deep, genuine warmth that cuts straight through the freezing air. "But it is far too cold in that house for you and the baby. I want you to come over right now. Claire just arrived from the city. I have plenty of hot food, and the heat is turned up high. Come have dinner with us." Rachel hesitates, the familiar heavy weight of shame pulling her gaze down toward the floorboards. "I couldn't impose again," she murmurs softly. "You've already done so much for me tonight. I don't want to intrude on your family time." "You are not an intrusion, my dear," Eleanor insists, reaching out to gently touch the younger woman's trembling arm. "You are my neighbor, And tonight, I have been given a remarkably beautiful gift, and I refuse to celebrate it behind closed doors. Please, bring the baby and come sit at our table, my child. True spiritual transformation is never meant to be hoarded in secret. When you finally experience the overwhelming, unmerited grace of my rescue, the only proper response is to immediately turn around and offer that exact same grace to someone else who is still shivering in the dark. By actively choosing community over comfort and generosity over fear, Eleanor is breaking the final lingering chain of her agonizing grief. Rachel looks into Eleanor's eyes, seeing the absolute unwavering sincerity shining there. Slowly, the young mother nods a fragile, grateful smile, breaking through her exhaustion. 10 minutes later, the quiet, empty house is completely transformed. The heavy oak table in the kitchen is set beautifully with the blue floral plates, completely covering the exact spot where the terrifying foreclosure notice had rested just an hour before. Steam rises in thick, fragrant clouds from the large ceramic bowls of soup. The bright overhead light illuminates the faces of 3 remarkably different women, brought together by the beautiful, unpredictable choreography of grace. Claire holds baby Leo in her lap, expertly bouncing him on her knee and making soft, silly noises that cause the infant to erupt into bright, ringing giggles. Rachel eats her warm meal slowly, her tense shoulders finally dropping as she listens to Claire talk about the chaotic traffic in the city. Eleanor simply sits at the head of the table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, completely absorbing the incredible, vibrant sounds of life, filling her home once again. The house is full of laughter. It echoes down the narrow hallway, bounces off the painted walls of Arthur's old study, and completely fills the sacred spaces that had been hollowed out by months of profound sorrow. Eleanor realizes with a deep, soaring joy in her chest that her husband's legacy was not merely the wood and brick of this building. His legacy was the love and safety they had provided for others within it. She watches her daughter smile brightly at the young mother across the table, and Eleanor's heart completely overflows with a profound, abiding peace. The terrifying storm has officially passed, leaving behind a soil that is rich, watered, and perfectly ready for a brand new season of growth. As the evening winds down, Eleanor steps onto the porch alone, looking up at the night sky. Oh, what did? She pulls her thick, familiar cardigan a little tighter against the biting chill of the night air. But the freezing temperature no longer feels like a cruel, invading enemy. The vast, stretching darkness above the roofline is no longer a canvas of suffocating isolation or impending doom. It is a magnificent, breathtaking display of countless brilliant stars, each one meticulously placed and held perfectly secure by my own hand. Through the slightly open frosted window, just behind her shoulder, she can hear the gentle melodic sound of Claire, humming a very old familiar hymn, as she washes the blue floral plates in the warm, soapy water of the kitchen sink. That sweet sound is occasionally interrupted by Rachel's quiet, grateful voice, and the soft, contented sighs of a sleeping baby who is finally completely warm. Those incredibly beautiful everyday sounds of vibrant life and restored fellowship drift out onto the wooden porch, wrapping around Eleanor's exhausted frame like a heavy, comforting quilt. She rests her forearms gently on the wooden railing, the rough, peeling grain feeling remarkably familiar and deeply grounding beneath her skin. She looks up into the infinite expanse of the heavens, her breath pluming in small, delicate white clouds that quickly vanish into the dark atmosphere. Just 24 agonizing hours ago, she had stood in this exact same spot, feeling entirely crushed by the terrifying weight of an impossible looming deadline. She had looked up at this very same sky and felt nothing but an echoing, devastating silence. She had been entirely convinced that her broken, desperate prayers were simply bouncing off the frozen clouds and falling back to the earth completely unheard. She had believed the cruel, persistent lie that because her physical circumstances were rapidly deteriorating, her spiritual reality was equally abandoned. She had measured my love for her by the balance in her checking account and the threatening letters in her mailbox. But as she stands there now, feeling the deep, abiding, miraculous peace that has completely settled into the very marrow of her bones, a profound and beautiful revelation washes over her exhausted spirit. She realizes with a quiet, breathtaking awe that her tears had reached heaven long before the thick corporate envelope ever arrived on her welcome mat. I had never once turned my face away from her agonizing grief. My child, I want you to look incredibly closely at Eleanor as she stands bathed in the pale silver moonlight, because her difficult journey is so often an exact reflection of your own. When you are standing in the absolute center of your most terrifying storm, the wind completely drowns out the sound of my voice. When the medical reports bring frightening life-altering news, when the bank accounts are entirely depleted, and when the deafening silence of an empty house threatens to completely consume your fragile mind, you feel so incredibly, painfully isolated. You look up at the dark night sky and genuinely wonder if I have somehow forgotten your name. You cry out in the middle of the dark, restless night, your chest aching with a sorrow so heavy you cannot even find the words to articulate it, and you mistakenly interpret the immediate lack of a physical miracle as a definitive sign of my absence. But I am telling you right now, with all the fierce, unwavering, compassionate love of a father who numbers the very hairs on your head, that absolutely none of your pain is ever wasted, and none of your suffering is ever unseen. Your tears do not simply fall into the dirt and disappear into the ground. Long before you ever see the practical earthly resolution to your agonizing conflict, your cries have already entered my throne room. I collect every single one of them. I feel the profound, staggering weight of your grief, the exact moment it forms in your fragile heart, and I am already actively setting into motion a beautiful, redemptive plan that will ultimately work all things together for your ultimate good. You see, the magnificent, life-changing miracle in Eleanor's life tonight was not merely the sudden arrival of a forgotten life insurance policy. The true, lasting, eternal miracle was the profound transformation that occurred within her own internal spirit. If I had simply deposited the necessary funds directly into her trembling hands the very first moment she asked, she would have kept her heavy, suffocating mask of pride firmly in place. She would have continued to proudly carry her terrifying burdens entirely alone, hiding her fragile vulnerability from her grieving daughter and completely missing the beautiful healing fellowship of opening her doors to a struggling neighbor. She would have saved her physical house, but she would have remained a permanent spiritual prisoner to her own isolating independence. I allowed the intense emotional pressure to build, not to break her completely, but to gently force her to let go of the heavy rusted chains of her self-reliance. I permitted the car battery to fail in the freezing driveway, so she could finally empty her shattered heart in the quiet safety of that dark cabin, making the necessary room for the profound peace that only comes from an absolute, unconditional surrender. I sent a wise, gentle pastor in a worn canvas jacket to sit directly in the messy, chaotic ashes of her kitchen, simply to remind her that true vulnerability is the only honest pathway to genuine healing. Every single setback was actually a deliberate, loving setup. Every moment of agonizing failure was actively preparing her for an undeniable spiritual victory. My precious child, please hear my voice whispering directly to your own tired, battered spirit today. You do not have to be an unbreakable rock for the people around you. You do not have to have the entire terrifying road meticulously mapped out and perfectly managed before you can take a single trembling step forward in faith. It is perfectly acceptable to bring your messy, complicated, and entirely unresolved reality directly to my feet. When you finally release your desperate, frantic grip on the outcomes you think you so desperately need, you create the sacred empty space necessary for me to provide exactly what you truly require. Eleanor takes one final, incredibly deep breath of the crisp winter air, a brilliant, remarkably genuine smile touching her lips as she looks at the stars one last time. She turns her back to the darkness, pulls open the heavy wooden door, and steps back inside, returning to the joyous, vibrant warmth of her beautifully restored family. She is stepping into a brand new season fully equipped with a resilient, hard-won, incredibly deep faith that cannot be shaken by the unpredictable, terrifying winds of this broken world. She knows now that she will never walk through a single valley alone. And now I am inviting you to step into that exact same incomprehensible peace. Wherever you are right now, whatever terrifying deadline is looming over your own life, whatever secret grief you have been hiding from the people who love you, I ask you to simply stop running. Stop hiding your profound brokenness behind a polite, exhausted, artificial smile. Lean entirely into my steadfast, unchanging embrace, and allow me to carry the incredibly heavy burdens that were never designed for your fragile shoulders. I invite you to pause, to quiet your mind, and to rest in the unshakable truth that I am already holding your tomorrow. Let us pray together. Lord, I come to you right now, exactly as I am, without any pretense or pride. I thank you with all my heart that you never require me to hide my deep pain or pretend that I am strong when my entire world feels like it is falling apart. Today I am so incredibly tired of carrying these heavy, terrifying burdens entirely on my own. I am carrying deep fears about my family, paralyzing anxieties about my uncertain future, and an agonizing sorrow that I have tried to mask for far too long. I ask for your gentle guiding wisdom to show me the next right step. Give me the profound courage to be truly vulnerable with the people around me, and grant me the spiritual strength to surrender my desperate need for control directly into your highly capable hands. I choose to trust that you are actively working all things together for my good, even in the agonizing spaces of waiting. And I ask that your perfect abiding peace would completely guard my fragile heart tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.